Hey, welcome back, friend. Come on in, settle in wherever you're comfortable tonight. Pull the blanket a little closer, dim whatever light is still on, let your shoulders drop. You've made it here, and that's enough. Tonight on Sleepy Old World, we're stepping through a very particular door. The ordinary door, the one with a little brass knocker and a welcome mat that was scrubbed clean this morning, before anyone in the neighbourhood was awake to notice. We're stepping into the daily life of an ordinary American woman in the 1950s, and I want to warn you gently. The version we're visiting tonight is not the one from the television programmes. It's not the pearl necklace and the spotless apron and the husband who arrives home to a wife who looks as though she spent the afternoon reading quietly. It is something much more honest, and in my opinion something far more remarkable. If you want to help this channel keep going, keep making these long, slow journeys through history for your late nights and your quiet moments, a like and a subscribe truly mean more than I can say. It costs you nothing, and it motivates me to keep making these videos. Drop a comment too. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is. I read every single one, and it means more than you know. Here is what I want to tell you before we begin, because these facts have stayed with me since the first time I really understood them. In 1950, a married American woman in most states could not open a bank account in her own name without her husband's signature. She could not apply for a credit card on her own. In many places she could not take out a loan, sign a lease, or make a legal contract without a man to co-sign. And the average American housewife of that decade walked an estimated 7 miles per day inside her own home, back and forth across the kitchen floor, up and down the stairs, through the hallway to the laundry room and back again, as part of the physical labour of simply keeping the household running. Roughly 1 in 3 American women was employed outside the home by 1950, a fact that the television programmes of the era chose with remarkable consistency to pretend did not exist. And the labour a full-time housewife performed, if calculated in wages at the rates of the services she replaced, would have equalled somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 a year in today's equivalent. It was never paid. It was never named. It was simply expected. That is where we are starting tonight. Now. Close your eyes for just a moment and picture this. It is somewhere in the middle of 1953. The exact town doesn't quite matter. It could be any one of dozens that sprang up like dandelions in the years after the war ended. Levittown, New York, Park Forest, Illinois, Lakewood, California. Anywhere that a developer looked at a field and saw 10,000 houses waiting to happen, and built them, fast, in rows so neat they looked like they'd been drawn with a ruler. Streets with names like Maple Drive and Elm Court and Birchwood Lane. Streets that did not yet have full-grown trees on them, because the trees had only been planted a few years ago and were still young and thin and not quite providing the shade anyone had hoped for. The lawns were mowed, the driveways were new, the houses sat close together with a few feet of yard between them on each side, close enough to hear a neighbour's back door open, close enough to register whether someone's garbage cans were out on the right day. One of these houses, let's say the one with the pale yellow shutters and the chrysanthemums planted in a neat row along the front walk, has its kitchen light on already, though the sky outside is barely beginning to grey. There is a woman in that kitchen. She's been awake for 20 minutes. She slipped out of bed before the alarm went off. She often does. Because lying there waiting for it to ring feels worse somehow than simply getting up. The bedroom was cool. She pulled the covers carefully back up over her husband's shoulder, retrieved her robe from the hook on the back of the door, and padded down the hall in her slippers without making a sound. The children are still asleep. The house has that particular early morning silence that exists only in the hour before anyone else wakes up. A silence with texture to it, somehow both heavy and very still. She is 29 years old. Her name, let's call her something common for the era. Something her mother might have chosen from a baby name book in the mid-20s. Let's call her Margaret. She might go by Marge to her friends, though her mother-in-law always uses the full name, enunciating both syllables with a certain mild emphasis that Margaret has never quite decoded. She's not dressed yet. Her hair is in rollers, small pink plastic ones wound tight against her scalp, covered by a cotton scarf she knotted at the forehead before bed. Her face is bare and soft with sleep. She looks, in this moment, nothing like the version of herself she will present to the world in 2 hours. She's simply a woman standing in her kitchen at 6 a.m, filling the percolator, measuring the coffee, beginning the day. Let's stay with her. The kitchen in the house with the yellow shutters is small by the standards of the television sets that beam their aspirational versions into living rooms across the country every night. The counter runs along 2 walls in an L shape, laminate in a pale mint green that was the height of modern style when they moved in 4 years ago. The refrigerator is white and boxy, with a small freezer compartment at the top just large enough to hold 2 ice cube trays and a container of ice cream on a good week. The stove is gas, 4 burners and an oven whose temperature gauge she's learned to distrust by about 15 degrees in either direction. Above the stove there is no exhaust fan. Those were still unusual in most post-war tract homes. And so the kitchen fills with steam and cooking smell every morning, and the window above the sink must be cracked regardless of the weather to keep things from getting close. The floor is linoleum. She washed it yesterday on her hands and knees with a scrub brush, which is why it currently has that particular clean brightness that lasts for approximately 1 day before the family's foot traffic begins working on it again. She knows this. She's not bitter about it. It is simply the nature of floors. She fills the percolator from the cold tap, measures out the coffee with the particular focused attention of someone performing a task they have done so many times. It should be automatic, but isn't quite. Coffee is one of those things she won't get wrong, because coffee is the thing her husband notices before he notices anything else in the morning. 2 scoops, not quite heaping. Set it on the back left burner, which runs slightly hotter than the others, and turn the flame to medium. She will monitor it, while the coffee begins its slow, promising hiss and burble. She starts on breakfast, and this is the part where things get interesting, where the gap between the popular image of the 1950s housewife and the actual physical reality begins to open up. Because Margaret does not stand at the counter yawning pleasantly while a perfect meal assembles itself. She stands at the counter and she works, not at a pace that looks dramatic from the outside, but with the quiet, steady efficiency of someone who has performed these exact motions every day for years and has arranged them into the most economical sequence possible. It is the efficiency not of ease but of mastery. The orange juice comes first. She has a glass juicer, the kind with a ridged cone in the centre, and she halves 4 oranges on the cutting board and presses each one down with both hands, turning and pressing, turning and pressing. The citrus smells sharp and bright in the quiet kitchen. This takes real effort. 4 oranges, both hands working against the resistance of the fruit. Her wrists have grown strong from this and from other things, from kneading bread dough and wringing out laundry and scrubbing surfaces and 100 other daily uses of her hands that have left them capable in a way she never thinks about because she has never known them to be otherwise. The bacon goes into the cast iron skillet next. She sets it over the front right burner on medium-low. Cast iron needs time to come up to temperature properly, and lays the strips in carefully so they don't curl up and cook unevenly. Then the bread into the toaster, the plates pulled from the cabinet, the butter dish retrieved from the refrigerator and set out to soften slightly, his coffee cup and saucer arranged with the handle facing right, the way he prefers it. She cracks the eggs into a bowl and sets them aside. She won't scramble them until she hears him moving around upstairs, because eggs go cold in under 2 minutes, and cold scrambled eggs are something she considers a small but genuine failure. There is a theory, not well documented, but held with conviction by anyone who has ever run a household for a family, that the morning operates on a kind of invisible engineering. Every element has to be ready at the right time, which means everything has to be started at a slightly different time, each one calibrated against all the others. The coffee at the right temperature when he sits down, the toast warm but not yet cold, the juice poured at the last possible moment so it doesn't go flat and warm in the glass. The eggs finished exactly when everything else is ready, not a moment before. Getting this right, every day, without seeming to manage it, without any of the logistics becoming visible as logistics, that is the art of it. That is what made a good housewife good, according to the standards of 1953. The invisibility of the work, the seamless appearance of effortless provision. Margaret has been effortless by this definition for 4 years. She hears the alarm go off upstairs, she has beaten it again by a few minutes, and then the sound of her husband's feet on the floor, the particular creak of the second step on the stairs that she has learned to register as automatically as her own name. His name is Robert. He sells insurance for a company downtown and wears a suit to the office every day. One of 3 he rotates through the week, and Margaret presses each one on Sunday evening for the week ahead. She hears the bathroom door, the sound of water running. She pushes the skillet aside slightly, cracks the eggs into the hot fat, and works them with a fork. 2 minutes, maybe less, by the time Robert appears in the kitchen doorway in his undershirt and suit trousers. The table is set, the coffee is poured, the orange juice is in his glass, and the bacon and eggs are on his plate, and the toast is in the toast rack. She has a silver plate toast rack that belonged to her mother, one of the few genuinely elegant objects in the house, and she uses it every morning. And she is standing at the counter untying her robe, because she will take it off now and put her apron on, and she will make sure she looks at least slightly presentable before he sits down, even if she is still in rollers, because the rollers cannot come out yet, the set won't be ready, and she has learned to carry the dignity of the situation through composure and attention rather than appearance. She smiles at him when he comes through the door. Good morning. The smile is genuine. She loves her husband. This is not complicated. He sits. He reaches for the paper, which she retrieved from the front porch when she came downstairs, and he opens it without looking at the table, and she fills his coffee cup from the percolator without being asked, and the morning has begun. She does not sit down. There is no time, and also it wouldn't quite be right. Not yet. Not while he is eating and she hasn't eaten and the children will be awake in 20 minutes, and there is still the second set of breakfasts to prepare and lunches to assemble, and the whole complicated machinery of getting 2 children out of the house and onto the school bus in a condition that will not cause comment. She drinks her own first cup of coffee standing at the counter, looking out the window above the sink at the lightening sky, and this exact moment, the kitchen warming up around her, the coffee in her hand, the house quiet except for Robert's newspaper rustling, is perhaps the closest she comes all day to something she might call peace. The house itself is worth understanding before we follow Margaret through her day, because it is not simply the backdrop to her work. In a genuine sense, it is her domain and her responsibility, and her daily adversary, and her source of pride, all at once. And it was built in a way that makes certain assumptions about how it would be used and by whom. The house is a Cape Cod style, 2 stories, with the main living spaces on the ground floor, and 2 small bedrooms tucked under the roofline upstairs where the ceilings slope. There is a 3rd small bedroom on the ground floor that functions as the master, which means Robert and Margaret sleep apart from the children in theory, though in practice the walls are thin enough that no one is truly private from anyone else. The house is about 950 square feet, which sounds small but is actually close to average for what was built in the early 1950s in communities like this one. It is 3 years old. It was built in 4 days by a construction crew that was working at the pace of a modest factory, reproducing the same design over and over in the same subdivision. The bones are good, the details are thin, the windows stick in summer when the frames swell with humidity. The basement takes on a faint smell of damp when it rains. The living room is the room Robert and Margaret's social identity is most visible in. It is furnished carefully, with the sense that these objects were chosen and placed with some thought. There is a sofa in a warm beige fabric with 2 matching armchairs, a coffee table bought on installment from a furniture store in town. She has 2 more payments remaining, with a glass surface she polishes every few days, curtains in a deep cream color that she sewed herself from fabric she bought at the dry goods store, because ready-made curtains were expensive and she could do it herself in a weekend of work. There is a small bookshelf with a selection of Reader's Digest condensed books, and a few novels and the Bible, and a set of encyclopedias they are still paying for. On the wall above the sofa hangs a framed print of a pastoral scene, rolling hills, a farmhouse, something gentle, that came with a frame she bought at Woolworth's. The television set is against the far wall, a zenith in a wooden cabinet, the most expensive object in the room, and one that still carries a slight air of the miraculous for Margaret, who grew up without one. The dining area is a small L-shaped extension of the living room, with a table that seats 4 and can be expanded for company by inserting 2 leaves stored in the hall closet. The chairs have padded seats that Margaret covered in a green fabric 2 years ago when the original covering began to show wear. The dining room, when guests are coming, is where Margaret's considerable domestic talent is most fully deployed and most clearly visible, and she is quietly proud of what she can do with it. And then the kitchen, always back to the kitchen. In a house this size, with this woman living in it, the kitchen is where the real story is told. Now let's stay close to the morning, because the morning contains more complexity than it appears to from the outside. Robert eats quickly. Men of this generation and this social station tended to, at breakfast. The meal was fuel, not occasion, and the paper absorbed most of his attention between bites. He had his eggs, his bacon, his toast with butter, and a scraping of orange marmalade from the jar Margaret refilled from her own homemade batch every 2 weeks. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He put down the paper and pushed back his chair at 6:53 by the kitchen clock, and that is the signal for the second act of the morning to begin. Margaret has already, while he ate, been mentally running through the checklist of what Robert needs to leave the house in proper condition. His suit jacket is hanging on the back of the dining chair. She retrieved it from the closet and checked it last night. No loose buttons, no visible lint, a slight scuff on the left lapel from where it had brushed against something, dabbed out with a damp cloth. His shoes. He has 2 pairs of dress shoes, black and brown, and today is a black shoe day, and she polished them on Sunday, and they are in the front closet waiting. His briefcase is by the door. In the inside pocket of his jacket she has, this morning, slipped a clean folded handkerchief from the stack in his dresser drawer, because he goes through one a day, and she launders and irons the whole stack on Thursday. He goes upstairs to finish dressing. She begins the second breakfast. The children are Thomas, who is 7, and little Patty, who will turn 5 in March. They sleep in the room under the left slope of the roof, in twin beds with matching bedspreads in a red and white checked fabric that Margaret bought last spring. She hears them before she sees them. There is the particular thumping sound of small people getting out of beds, not entirely of their own accord, which means she has gone to the foot of the stairs and called up to them in that specific maternal register that is not quite a command and not quite a request, but is understood by any child over the age of 3 to mean now. Getting Thomas and Patty through the morning is a different kind of work than getting Robert through it. Robert is grown and self-directing once the conditions are right. The children require management at every stage, and the management must be pleasant enough not to cause the kind of early morning meltdown that will derail the whole timeline, because the school bus comes at 8:15 and there is no second option. Patty comes down first in her pajamas, her hair tangled and her expression slightly stunned with sleep, and Margaret scoops her up briefly at the bottom of the stairs, just for a moment, a quick warm hold, before setting her on her feet and pointing her toward the bathroom. Face and hands, she says. Thomas appears next, already half-dressed in the clothes he apparently picked out himself, which would be fine except that what he has selected is a combination that Margaret is going to quietly redirect, not with criticism but with what she calls the better idea approach. Actually, I thought you might wear the blue shirt today. It's your favorite and it's clean. She holds it up. Thomas considers. The negotiation takes 30 seconds and ends without drama, which is a small victory she carries with her for the next hour. Breakfast for the children is simpler. Oatmeal in winter, cold cereal in the warmer months, always with milk, sometimes with a half glass of orange juice if there is enough. Today, because she had oranges for Robert, she pours a small glass for each child as well. They eat with the focused inattention of children who are thinking about other things, and she sits with them briefly now. Finally, her own plate of toast and scrambled eggs that she made in the residual heat of the skillet after Robert's were done. The eggs are slightly overdone. She eats them without comment. The lunches are already half assembled. She made the sandwiches last night, wrapped them in wax paper and stored them in the refrigerator. Peanut butter and jelly for Patty, who will not eat any other sandwich on any day of the week, a fact that Margaret has accepted without attempting to change. Thomas gets a bologna sandwich with yellow mustard. She packs them into the metal lunch boxes. Thomas has a Roy Rogers one. Patty's is plain red, along with an apple, a small bag of cookies she baked on Tuesday, and a thermos of cold milk apiece. She does this while simultaneously monitoring Thomas's progress with his oatmeal and answering a question from Patty about whether butterflies sleep, and folding a note for Thomas's teacher about the school picture money. She does all of this, and it looks, to anyone watching, like nothing much. Patty's hair requires attention. This is a daily small drama. Patty has fine hair that tangles in the night and has to be combed out gently each morning, a process she endures with the particular patient suffering of a child who has been through this many times and knows that protest makes it longer, not shorter. Margaret is practiced and efficient with the comb. She knows exactly where the tangles form and approaches them from the ends rather than the roots, working upward, which she has done since Patty was old enough to sit still. Then 2 neat braids, tied with the small ribbons that match her dress. Patty has opinions about ribbons. Today she wants the yellow ones. The dress is blue. Margaret decides that this battle is not worth having and finds the yellow ribbons. By 8 o'clock the kitchen is clear. The children are dressed. The lunches are packed. The school bags are at the door, and Margaret is standing in the downstairs bathroom, with the rollers coming out one by one, her fingers working quickly through the curl she has been cultivating since the night before. She has 12 minutes before the bus comes. She has done this in less. The hair is a topic worth pausing on, because hair in 1953 was not merely a matter of appearance. It was a daily statement of effort and respectability, and the standards for what constituted acceptable hair on a married woman in a neighborhood like this one were specific and required consistent maintenance. Margaret has what is called a set. She washes her hair twice a week, sets it in rollers while it is damp, sleeps on it to let it dry, and then combs it out in the morning into waves and curls that are supposed to look natural but that require considerable technical knowledge to produce. A woman with limp, uncombed hair in public would be noticed, not confronted, that was not done, but noticed and registered and filed away in the neighborhood's collective assessment of who she was and how well she was managing. So every morning there are 12 minutes in the bathroom with a comb and a can of Helene Curtis hairspray and a hand mirror so she can check the back. And what emerges is a woman who looks, by the time she is done, like she has taken genuine care. The lipstick goes on last. She has a tube of Revlon Fire and Ice in the medicine cabinet. Well used, worn down to an awkward angle at the tip. She applies it by muscle memory. Presses her lips together on a folded square of tissue. There, presentable. She walks Thomas and Patty to the end of the drive at 8:10. The bus comes at 8:14, and she stands at the curb until it has pulled away and she can no longer see Thomas's face in the window, watching her. She waves. She always waves until she can no longer see them, because she has read or been told somewhere, she cannot now remember where, that children feel secure when they see their mother still watching. She has never verified this, but she has never stopped doing it. And then the bus is gone, and the street is quiet, and Margaret walks back up the drive to the house with the yellow shutters, and the door closes behind her, and she is alone. This is the part of the day that almost nobody talks about when they talk about 1950s housewives. Not the cooking, not the cleaning, not the husband's breakfast, the long middle of the day. The house, emptied of everyone, settling into its morning quiet. The particular quality of silence in a home that held 4 people 2 hours ago and holds 1 person now. She stands in the kitchen for a moment, looking at it. The breakfast dishes are stacked by the sink. She didn't do them yet, she will now. The table is crumbed and needs wiping. There is a smear of oatmeal on the chair where Patty sat that needs attention before it dries into something stubborn. The coffee pot is still on the back burner with an inch of coffee in the bottom. The kitchen contains in these small details the entire morning's work, and she surveys it the way a farmer surveys a field, with the practical eye of someone deciding what to address in what order. Monday is wash day. This is not a choice, particularly, or rather, it is a choice that has calcified over time into something that feels like a natural law. Monday is wash day in this house and in the houses on either side, and Margaret suspects in most of the houses on the street. It has probably been wash day in most of these neighborhoods since the houses were built, because wash day requires an early start and a dry afternoon, and has an organizational logic to it that makes Monday the natural anchor. Let me stay with the laundry for a long time, because it is one of the places where the 1950s housewife's physical reality diverges most sharply from the cheerful image of the era, and also because it is genuinely fascinating once you understand what it involved. The machine in Margaret's basement is a wringer washer, not an automatic. Those existed by 1953, but they were expensive, and Robert and Margaret have been married 4 years and are careful with money, and the wringer washer works fine, and the automatic is on a list of things they are saving toward. That also includes a new set of tires for the car and some work that needs doing on the porch steps. The wringer washer is a tub on legs with an electric motor, and attached to one side a pair of rubber rollers that the wet laundry is fed through to squeeze out the water. It does the washing part automatically. You fill it with hot water and soap and it agitates the clothes mechanically, but everything else requires her direct physical involvement. Loading the wet clothes through the wringer, which must be done carefully so that buttons don't break and thin fabrics don't tear, rinsing the clothes in a second tub of clean water, running them through the wringer a second time, carrying the wet laundry out to the backyard. The amount of physical labor in those 3 sentences is hard to convey in the abstract, so let me try to be specific. A load of sheets, 2 large sheets, 2 pillowcases, flat and fitted, weighs several pounds dry. Wet, they weigh considerably more, and wet laundry is also unwieldy, the way anything heavy and shapeless is unwieldy, resistant to being gathered or carried in any clean, organized way. She carries each load in a wicker basket up the basement stairs, out the back door, to the clothesline that runs between 2 poles at the back of the yard. She hangs each piece individually with wooden clothespins, smoothing and straightening them so they dry without creases. On a good Monday in summer or early fall, this is pleasant work. There is something satisfying about clotheslines filled with clean laundry and sunshine. In winter it is something else entirely. The laundry freezes. She has hung sheets in January and watched them stiffen into boards on the line within 20 minutes, and then she carries them back inside stiff and cold and drapes them over the wooden drying racks in the basement and waits. The sequence of a wash day is dictated by what needs to go in first and in what temperature water, which is governed by what can withstand what. White items go first, in the hottest water with the most bleach. The whites, Robert's shirts, the good table linens, Thomas and Patty's school socks, come out bright and clean from hot water and bleach, but the hot bleached water then goes grey and must be replenished or cooled for the next load. Then the coloured items, dresses, blouses, children's clothes, curtains when they are being done. Then the darks, then work clothes if there are any, and cleaning rags, last in the coolest, greyest water. This sequence, on a typical wash week, produces somewhere between 4 and 6 loads. Each load takes the machine 20 minutes to agitate, plus the time to load and unload the wringer, plus the hanging. On a Monday where everything goes smoothly, the laundry takes the better part of the morning. On a Monday where Patty was sick last week and the linens need extra runs, or where Margaret decides the bathroom rugs need doing, it bleeds into the afternoon. And then, of course, there is the ironing, which is not done on Monday, which is done on Tuesday, once the Monday laundry is dry and folded and waiting in the basket. The ironing deserves its own understanding, and I find myself slightly awed by it every time I sit with the specifics. In 1953, the list of items that required ironing in a household like Margaret's was very different from any list a modern person would recognize, because modern fabrics, permanent press, polyester, drip-dry cotton, did not yet exist in any widespread way. Everything was cotton or linen or wool, and cotton and linen wrinkle. They wrinkle enthusiastically, with the full commitment of natural fibers freed from the tension of wear. A cotton dress pulled fresh from the line looked, before ironing, like it had been slept in by a distressed person. A linen tablecloth off the line was a topographic exercise in creases. The iron itself was heavy. Margaret has a steam iron with a dial for temperature, a good one, better than the flat irons of earlier generations that had to be heated on the stove, but it is still an iron, which means it is dense and hot, and must be moved carefully and held at the right angle, and the wrist must not falter, because a faulted iron on a cotton shirt leaves a brown mark shaped exactly like the iron's sole plate, and that mark was a small catastrophe. The ironing board stood in the kitchen or the dining room, depending on where Margaret chose to set up, and she ironed on Tuesday afternoons while the radio played and the house was quiet. She ironed Robert's shirts, all 3, plus the ones from the week before that he'd worn and that she'd washed Monday, and she ironed them to a standard that is worth describing in some detail. Collar first, spread flat, the points pressed sharp, then the yoke across the back, then the sleeves, each one with a sharp crease down the center so it lay flat when the cuff was buttoned, then the front panels, around the buttons not over them, then the back. A shirt took perhaps 8 minutes done properly. 3 shirts was 24 minutes, plus the handkerchiefs, 2 minutes each, plus the children's school clothes, plus the pillowcases, plus the curtains when they were done. She ironed Robert's shirts because they had to be ironed, because the standard for a man in a white-collar job in 1953 included a pressed shirt, and a man's pressed shirt was considered an extension of his wife's management of the household, in the same way that a dirty floor or unpolished shoes reflected on her. The connection was not subtle. Women understood it explicitly. The quality of a man's appearance at work was, in the social grammar of the era, a legible record of his wife's diligence at home. She ironed them gladly, in the way that you can be glad about a task you have mastered, in the way that competence itself produces satisfaction. But I want to stay with the physical reality of all this for just a moment longer, because it is easy to read words like laundry and ironing and let them flatten into abstraction. The woman in the basement on Monday morning, her hands in rubber gloves because the bleach and the hot water and the laundry soap are cruel to skin, feeding sheets through the wringer's rubber rollers, watching the water squeeze out in a grey-white sheet and the linen emerge on the other side flat and heavy and still damp but wrung. That is a physical act. Her back is bent slightly from the angle. The basement is warm from the machine. Her wrists feel the resistance of the wringer, which requires pressure to feed the cloth through evenly. She has done this so many times that she has a small callus on the inner edge of her right thumb where it presses against the roller. She has never mentioned this callus to anyone because it has not occurred to her that there is anything worth mentioning about it. Now let's come back upstairs and follow the rest of the morning, because wash day is not the only thing happening on a Monday. The laundry is running in the basement and Margaret is moving through the house with the steady, practiced attention of someone who knows exactly what needs to happen and in what order, and the house itself is responding, being brought back to a particular standard of order and cleanliness that will hold, more or less, until the family comes home and begins undoing it. The making of beds comes after the laundry has been started and before the floors. She strips the children's beds on Monday for wash day, pillowcases, flat sheets, fitted sheets, and remakes them with the clean set from last week's wash. A made bed in 1953 was a specific thing, fitted sheet pulled tight with the corners hospital folded so there were no loose flaps at the sides, flat sheet folded back at the top in a precise 6-inch cuff, pillow in its case and squared at the head, bedspread pulled over and smoothed so the surface was flat enough to show no shadow from the light. Patty's bedspread has a small stuffed rabbit that lives on the pillow. Margaret places it back in the center when she makes the bed, same position every day, because Patty notices and cares. Thomas's room is more of a challenge, as Thomas has a relationship with his belongings that operates on a system legible only to himself. She does not interfere with his organizing principle, whatever it is, but she does straighten the surface of things. Books are lined on the shelf, shoes in the closet, the baseball mitt on its hook by the door. She picks up the socks from the floor, which she will always find on the floor. She has decided that this is Thomas, and Thomas is worth it, and she says nothing. The master bedroom is last. She makes their bed with the same precision she applies to the children's, though with better sheets. They have a good set of percal that she saved up for and is careful with, and she straightens Robert's side of the dresser, where a small organized cluster of objects lives: his comb, his watch stand, a dish of collar stays, a small bottle of bay rum. She has not moved these objects in 4 years. She dusts around them in place. Then the floors. The vacuum cleaner is a Hoover, an upright model in two-tone grey, and it lives in the hall closet and comes out 3 times a week in the main rooms and once a week for the bedrooms. There is a particular satisfaction to vacuuming that Margaret has always felt. The visible transformation of the carpet surface from the pale, slightly matted look of a floor that has been lived on to the napped, upright look of a freshly vacuumed one, the parallel lines left by the machine's path that will last until someone walks on it. She vacuums in rows, overlapping each pass slightly, working backward out of the room so she doesn't walk on the freshly done carpet. She moves the furniture to vacuum under it and around it. The sofa gets lifted at one end and set down. The coffee table shifted and returned. She is not perfunctory about this. The kitchen floor does not get vacuumed. It is linoleum, but it gets swept with a broom and then mopped. The mop is a string mop in a metal bucket with a wringer built into the rim, and the water she uses is hot and has a cap of Murphy oil soap in it, and the smell of Murphy oil soap is for Margaret as it was for her mother before her, the smell of a clean floor being born. She mops in the same systematic way she vacuums, working from the back of the kitchen toward the door, and she props the back door open afterward to let it dry because she does not want anyone walking on it wet and leaving prints on her work. The bathroom is scrubbed on Mondays and Thursdays. The toilet bowl with its particular brush, the base of the toilet, behind the toilet where dust accumulates, the tank, the seat, the sink with powdered cleanser on a sponge, the faucets polished dry with a cloth so they don't leave water spots, the mirror, the floor on hands and knees, which gives her a clear view of every corner and allows her to address what the mop might leave behind. The tub on Thursdays, a full scrub and rinse production. She keeps the rubber gloves hung over the edge of the sink under the vanity, and she uses them for every cleaning task that involves bleach or strong chemicals, because her mother had beautiful hands and lost them early to housework, and Margaret noticed and made a quiet decision. Now, somewhere in the middle of all this, between the bathroom and the dusting after the floors, there is something worth paying attention to that I think often gets missed in the broad picture of the 1950s housewife's day. There is a window, not a literal window, though there are several of those, all of which she will wipe down with vinegar and newspaper on Thursday. A window of time, maybe 45 minutes, maybe a little longer on days when the laundry is running smoothly and the cleaning has gone efficiently. A gap between tasks, or rather between the morning's heavy labor and the preparations for the afternoon, where the house is as orderly as it is going to be for the day, and Robert is at work, and the children are at school, and the washing machine in the basement is doing its mechanical work without her. In this window, she sits down with the second cup of coffee she has poured and reheated, and finally, after all the morning's work, actually tasted. What does she do in this window? This is, I think, one of the most telling and also one of the least examined facts about the daily life of a 1950s housewife, because the answer was different for different women, and the difference said something about who each woman was beneath the role she was performing. Some women read. Margaret is a reader. She has a library card and uses it, and she keeps the current book in the kitchen drawer under the dish towels, because keeping it visible on the side table would suggest she had time she wasn't using, which would invite a certain kind of comment. She reads for 40 minutes when she can. She is currently on her third book of the year, which is not as many as she would like, but more than nothing. Some of her neighbors, she knows, spent this window on the telephone. The neighborhood operated on a kind of telephone information network that tracked who had done what and who had seen what, and what was happening in various kitchens and backyards. This was social in a genuine way. It was also surveillance, though no one used that word. A woman who was isolated from the network missed information she might need about a neighborhood problem, about a shared resource, about something concerning that someone's husband had said. Some women used the time for creative work, sewing, which many women of this generation did seriously and well, not as a hobby but as a skilled trade they'd been taught and practiced. Margaret can make clothes for herself and for Patty from commercial patterns, and sometimes she does, fitting the fabric and cutting it out on the dining room table, which she clears of everything else first. She is particularly good at colours. The window never lasts. It never quite has a chance to expand into something that feels like leisure, because the day has a gravitational pull toward the next thing and the next thing after that. But it is there, that window briefly, every morning when the house is quiet and the work is ahead of schedule and there is nobody needing anything. She finishes her coffee. She goes to the grocery store. The grocery run of the early 1950s is worth explaining, because it was different from shopping in ways that directly affected how Margaret organized her entire day. The refrigerator in the kitchen, that white boxy Frigidaire with the unreliable freezer compartment, could keep food cold but not indefinitely, and the culture around food storage in 1953 was still much closer to the pre-refrigeration era than it was to the future of frozen everything and weekly big-box shopping. Margaret shops every day, or nearly every day, not a major shopping expedition each time, often just a few items, the fresh things that don't keep, vegetables, bread if she hasn't baked, meat for dinner, milk if they're low. The pantry has staples, canned goods, dry goods, sugar and flour and baking powder and salt, but the fresh elements of each day's meals were chosen each morning based on what she was planning to make, and they were bought that morning or the afternoon before. This daily shopping had a social dimension that the once-a-week supermarket run of later decades would lose. Margaret knew the people at the grocery store. She knew Mr. Davies at the butcher counter. He remembered her preferences, her family's size, her budget, roughly, and he made recommendations based on these things, which constituted a kind of expertise she trusted more than she would have trusted an anonymous refrigerated display case. She knew the produce manager, whose name was Sal, and who would tell her when the tomatoes were going to be especially good that week, and when to wait and when to skip them entirely because they'd come in from somewhere that had had rain. This information was genuinely useful. It made her a better cook in practice than she would have been without it. She dressed to go to the grocery store. This is the part that makes modern people laugh or shake their heads, and I understand that response, but I want to offer some context before dismissing it. Her day dress, her good shoes, not her best shoes, but shoes with a heel, maybe an inch, her coat if the weather called for it, her lipstick freshly applied. She greeted the other women she saw by name. She kept her cart from wobbling. She did not linger over labels in a way that would make her look uncertain or impractical. The grocery run was a public appearance, however brief, and public appearances in the social world Margaret inhabited required polish. This was not vanity exactly. It was more than vanity. The way Margaret presented herself in public was, in the social economy of the neighborhood, a representation of her household's general state. A woman who was put together suggested a house that was put together, and a house that was put together suggested a husband who was well looked after, and a husband who was well looked after was the primary indicator of a wife's success by the metrics that mattered in 1953. The logic was circular and in retrospect not entirely fair, but it was the logic that existed, and it was enforced not by any single person, but by the collective awareness of the neighborhood women who are all collectively running the same system and therefore invested in its maintenance. The grocery store itself had a smell that I find myself dwelling on whenever I read descriptions of it from women of this era. Floor wax and cut flowers near the entrance, the particular sweetness of the bread aisle, something meaty and cold drifting from the direction of the butcher counter, and underneath everything the bright, clean smell of a store that was mopped every evening. The displays were arranged by a stock boy every morning, labels facing out, and this was considered important enough that the store manager checked it. There is a kind of world in which the arrangement of grocery labels facing forward is a matter of professional pride, and that was this world. She buys pork chops today. Mr. Davies recommends them without much preamble. 2 chops, medium thickness, nicely marbled. She buys carrots and potatoes, a head of cabbage she will turn into coleslaw, a quart of whole milk, a loaf of Wonder Bread because she is not baking today and the children need sandwiches for tomorrow. She considers apples and decides yes. She checks the price of butter. It has gone up 2 cents from last week, which she notes without comment but will mention to Robert tonight, not as a complaint but as information. At the checkout she waits. She does not look impatient. The woman ahead of her is buying what looks like a week's worth of canned goods and is writing a check, which takes some time. Margaret looks at the magazine rack beside the register. Ladies' Home Journal, Woman's Day, Good Housekeeping, McCall's. She picks up the Ladies' Home Journal because she has a recipe she wants to try for a new kind of casserole she saw advertised, and she reads the first page of an article while she waits, which tells her that a modern housewife can serve a dinner party of 8 with no more than 2 hours of advanced preparation, and she finds this information technically interesting but not quite corresponding to her own experience of dinner parties, and she sets the magazine back. She carries the groceries home in 2 brown paper bags, 1 on each arm. The bags are handled carefully. They are not particularly strong, and a broken bag at the corner of birchwood and maple, while not a crisis, would constitute the kind of minor public failure that stays with a person slightly longer than it should. Back in the kitchen, she puts things away. This takes less time than it sounds, because her pantry and refrigerator are organized with the same logic she applies to everything else. A place for everything, and everything in its place, and the place determined by what was used most often and what needed to be seen. The pork chops go in the refrigerator on the middle shelf where she can see them when she opens the door. The vegetables in the crisper drawer. The milk at the back, which is coldest. The bread in the bread box on the counter, which keeps it from going stale as quickly as it would in the open air. Then she thinks about dinner. Dinner in a 1953 household like Margaret's was not an event in the way a dinner party is an event. but it was not casual in the way that a modern Tuesday dinner might be casual. Something pulled from the freezer, something quick, something not quite intentional. Dinner was the anchoring meal of the day, the one around which the family assembled at a specific time and ate what she had made, hot and fresh, at the table with the leaves left in from Sunday. It was the 1 hour of the day when the household's various moving parts converged in the same room at the same time, and Margaret was responsible for what happened in that room in terms of both food and atmosphere. She starts thinking about dinner at 2 o'clock at the latest, because certain things take more time than they appear to. Pork chops tonight. She will brown them in the cast-iron skillet in lard. Shortening would work, but lard was what her mother used and she has not been persuaded to change. Then braise them in the oven for 40 minutes with onions and a little stock, mashed potatoes to go alongside, because Robert likes mashed potatoes with anything braised. Coleslaw from the cabbage she bought this morning, with her own dressing. She makes it with a little sugar, a little apple cider vinegar, mayonnaise, celery seed, a vegetable, the carrots, glazed with a little butter and brown sugar in the smaller skillet. She will make a cornbread to go with it, because she has cornmeal in the pantry, and because cornbread goes well with braised things, and because she genuinely likes making it. None of this is simple. Each element has its own timing, its own requirements, its own potential failure points, and they all need to be ready at the same time. The pork chops need to be browned and in the oven by 5:15 for a 6 o'clock dinner. The potatoes need to be peeled and cut and put in cold water to keep them from browning, then boiled for 20 minutes, then mashed with butter and the right amount of milk. Too much and they go gluey, too little and they won't smooth out properly. The cornbread needs to bake 30 minutes in the oven alongside the chops, which means she needs to time the removal of the chops from the braise to accommodate the cornbread's entry. She has an organized mind. These logistical puzzles do not stress her the way they might stress someone encountering them for the first time. She has solved some version of this puzzle every day for 4 years, and she knows the solutions well enough that she runs them in the background of whatever else she is doing in the afternoon, the way you might hum a familiar song without noticing. The afternoon, before the cooking begins in earnest, is the children's time. Thomas and Patty come home from school at 3:15. The bus stops at the corner and she meets them there, or on days when she is in the middle of something, flour on her hands, something on the stove, she watches from the window and has the door open before they reach the porch. This is the hour she has learnt to treat with more flexibility than any other part of the day, because children coming home from school arrive in an emotional condition that varies day to day, with a range she cannot predict in advance. Some days they are fine, loud and hungry and wanting to tell her something specific and immediate. Some days one or both of them are in a state she will need to tend to carefully, and the tending will take all her attention and the brownies she meant to make for tomorrow's bake sale will not get made. She keeps a plate of cookies or sliced apple or crackers and cheese ready for after school, because the years between lunch and dinner are long for a child's metabolism, and a hungry child is a more complicated child. This was her mother's wisdom, and she has tested it against experience and found it sound. Thomas eats 2 cookies without stopping on the way through the kitchen, and takes a third at the table where he opens his school bag and reveals the homework situation, which today is a page of arithmetic and a composition about an animal. He announces that he is going to write about horses, and then asks if he can go outside first, and Margaret says 45 minutes, and Thomas takes his cookies and goes. Patty is in a different mode today. Something happened at school, or rather, something happened in the social ecology of the kindergarten, the specific details of which are communicated to Margaret in a stream of information that requires interpretive skill to follow. A girl named Susan did something, or said something, or had something, and the something matters enormously in ways that will not fully make sense to anyone over the age of 6. Margaret sits with Patty at the kitchen table for 15 minutes while Patty eats her crackers and processes this, and she does not minimize the something or dismiss it or offer a solution, because she has learned that what Patty needs in this mode is not a solution. She needs to be heard making it make sense, and then she needs cookies and to go outside. The children are outside until 5. In 1953, outdoor time for children in a neighborhood like this one was genuinely, expansively outdoor. They ranged further from the house than seems imaginable to parents today, playing with neighborhood children in a loosely organized way that might involve the empty lot 2 blocks over, or the creek at the edge of the development, or simply the sidewalks and backyards of the immediate area. Margaret had a general awareness of where they were and trusted the neighborhood's collective supervision. Any adult neighbor would have intervened if something had gone wrong, and she knew each of those neighbors well enough to trust that. But she did not know the precise coordinates of her children at every moment. No one did. The children were outside. That was the operating category. This gave Margaret the late afternoon, which was when the cooking began in earnest. She peels the potatoes first, because potatoes are forgiving of waiting. Cut and submerged in cold water they will stay, patient, until she needs them. Then she pulls the cast-iron skillet from the bottom cabinet where it lives, on a layer of folded newspaper. Because cast iron is heavy and should not be stacked directly on other surfaces, and she sets it on the front burner to preheat while she blots the pork chops dry with a paper towel. Dry meat browns better, a fact she learnt from a magazine article about French cooking techniques that she has applied ever since, and seasons them with salt and pepper on both sides, pressing the seasoning slightly into the surface with her fingertips. The lard goes into the hot skillet and melts in about 30 seconds, spreading across the bottom in a transparent shimmer. She lays the chops in carefully, listening for the immediate sizzle that tells her the fat is the right temperature. Too quiet and the chops will steam instead of brown. Too violent and the outside will brown before the inside is anywhere near done. This one is right. She lets them go for 3 minutes without touching them. Moving them too early interrupts the browning, and uses the time to slice the onion, thin half-moons that she will add to the pan after the chops are flipped. The smell in the kitchen has changed in the last 5 minutes from the neutral smell of a cleaned house to something warm and full and animal. The smell of meat cooking in fat, which is one of those smells that is so fundamental to human domesticity that it communicates something across the whole house. Robert, when he comes home at 6, will smell this from the driveway, and it will mean something to him. Something about homecoming and provision and dinner waiting that he will never quite articulate, but that Margaret understands perfectly well. She flips the chops at 3 minutes. Good. A deep brown, slightly darker at the edges where the fat rendered. She adds the onions around them and listens to the different sizzle they make. Sharper, slightly sweet. She gives the pan a shake to seat them in the fat and transfers the whole thing to the oven, which she had turned on 20 minutes ago and is now at 350. She sets the timer. The cornbread batter comes next. A cup of cornmeal, half a cup of flour, a tablespoon of sugar, a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking powder, and an egg beaten with a cup of buttermilk and 2 tablespoons of the lard from the skillet, which she has poured off and reserved. She stirs this together until just combined. Cornbread is like muffins in that overworking the batter makes it dense, and she does not overwork it, and pours it into the greased cast-iron cornstick pan, the one shaped like ears of corn that was a wedding gift from her aunt, and that she still finds slightly charming. The coleslaw is made while the chops braise. She quarters and cores the cabbage, cuts it into very thin shreds with her big chef's knife. She is economical and confident with this knife, no tentative chopping, and puts it in a bowl with some shredded carrot from the bag. The dressing goes together in a minute. A tablespoon of sugar dissolved in a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar, stirred into a 1/4 cup of Best Foods mayonnaise, seasoned with celery seed and salt. She tastes it, adjusts the vinegar slightly, tosses it with the cabbage, covers the bowl and puts it in the refrigerator to let the flavors settle. Cold coleslaw is better than room temperature coleslaw. She has strong opinions about this. Robert comes home at 6:03 on weekdays, or rather that is his average. He is occasionally slightly earlier or slightly later, but never more than 20 minutes in either direction, and never without calling if he is going to be significantly delayed, which is a courtesy Margaret appreciates, and which other women in the neighbourhood have noted, not always neutrally, as evidence that Robert is a good husband. She hears his car in the driveway. She is mashing the potatoes. She checks her hair in the dark glass of the oven door. A practiced instinct, quick, not vain, and has everything she can have done, and the table set, and the children's hands washed and faces checked before the front door opens. The children run to him. This is their ritual, not trained but grown up naturally, and she finds it every time quietly, privately moving to watch. Robert crouches at the door to catch both of them, one arm around each, and rises with the two of them hanging from him like fruit from a tree, and he is talking. She can hear him from the kitchen, some version of the routine exchange. How was your day? What happened? Tell me everything. And Patty is already launching into the story of Susan from kindergarten, which she is going to have to tell again, it seems. Margaret calls out from the kitchen. 15 minutes. This is the family shorthand for dinner, and it gives Robert time to change out of his suit jacket and tie and into the comfortable clothes he wears at home. A practice Margaret privately thinks of as the shedding, the moment he becomes the version of himself that belongs to the house rather than the office. She has the chops resting on a plate under a piece of foil. Resting is important. It redistributes the juices, and she is making the gravy from the fond at the bottom of the braising pan, the brown bits and the braising liquid reduced and thickened with a small amount of flour, worked into butter, and then added to the pan liquid and stirred. Good gravy is one of those things that seems simple and is not quite simple. It needs heat and patience and the right amount of thickener, and it can go wrong in two different directions. Too thick and it sits on the plate like paste. Too thin and it runs off everything and pools uselessly. She gets it right every time. She is proud of this in the way you are proud of things that require real skill. Dinner is at the table by 6:25. The table is set properly, not formally, not with the good china that comes out for company, but with the everyday dishes and proper napkins folded in thirds, and a small vase of grocery store carnations in the center, because she bought them Monday, and they are still fresh and she likes flowers on the dinner table, which is one of the small private indulgences she has maintained as her own, not because anyone required it, but because it matters to her. The family sits. Robert says grace, a short one, the same words every night, or a variation on them, and then the food is distributed and the meal begins. This is where Margaret's day, in some sense, peaks. The product of 12 or 13 hours of planning and preparation and physical labor assembled on this table in the form of food that is hot and well made and sufficient, and the family eating it together, which is, she believes with a quiet and unspoken conviction, one of the most fundamentally important things that happens in this house. She eats last, not because anyone asked her to, not because there is a rule, but because someone is always needing something at the beginning of a meal. More milk, the gravy passed, the cornstick pan reached, and she has gotten into the habit of not fully sitting down until she is reasonably sure that the initial round of need has been met. This means her food is slightly cooler than everyone else's by the time she takes her first bite. She has learned not to notice this. The dinner conversation runs across Robert's day, the children's day, the small news of the neighborhood. Robert tells them about a client he visited today. Nothing confidential, just the human texture of an office interaction. A colleague who said something funny. Thomas announces, again, that he wants a dog. The response to this announcement is well practiced on all sides. Patty asks whether dogs eat carrots, which leads to a brief detour about what dogs eat, and then somehow to whether dinosaurs ate carrots. They did not. She and Robert explain gently there were no carrots during the dinosaurs, and this resolves into a conversation about whether dinosaurs liked anything at all, which nobody knows for certain, and somehow this leads to laughter, and the laughter is domestic and easy, the kind that emerges between people who share a space daily and know each other's specific frequencies. She pours more coffee without being asked. Cleaned up after dinner is another invisible machinery. The children help carry their plates to the sink. They are old enough, and she has made this a practice because she believes children should understand that plates do not carry themselves, a belief she holds for practical reasons as much as any philosophical ones. Robert disappears briefly and returns with his newspaper. The children are directed to teeth and pajamas and the first stage of the evening wind-down, which will take 30 minutes and involve one negotiation about the duration of tonight's story. She washes the dishes by hand. She has no dishwasher. The automatics existed. Some of her neighbors had them, and she had looked at one in the appliance store on Maple and thought about it. But they were expensive and took up counter space. And also, she has realized in herself, washing up is one of the day's few activities that is physical without being demanding, that requires enough attention to occupy the hands but not enough to occupy the mind, and she finds in it a kind of working quiet she doesn't always want to give up. Hot soapy water in the right basin, the plates stacked in the rack on the left, the rinse water on the right, the glasses first, then the plates, then the pots and pans, the cast iron skillet wiped with a cloth rather than washed because water breaks down the seasoning she has spent 4 years building. The kitchen is clean by 7:45. It will look, in the morning, exactly as it does now. The children are in bed by 8. She reads to them. Tonight it is Thomas's choice, and he chooses a chapter from a Hardy Boys book, and she reads with a slight performance, different voices for different characters, which Thomas is old enough to find slightly embarrassing, and which he secretly still likes. Patty is asleep before the chapter ends. Thomas does not quite admit to being sleepy but is quiet by the end of the chapter, and she tucks him in and kisses his forehead and turns off the light. Now the house is quiet again, in a different way from the morning's quiet. This is the evening's quiet, and it is not the housewife's quiet. It is the family's quiet, the quiet that follows a full day of occupation and effort, and she carries it into the living room where Robert is in his chair with the newspaper and the television is on at low volume, and she sits on the sofa and takes off her shoes, which she has been wearing for 12 hours with a heel, and the release of that is physical and immediate. She might sew for an hour. She is partway through a dress for Patty, yellow cotton with white rickrack trim at the hem, and her sewing basket is beside the sofa, and the work is the kind that goes well in the evening, in the lamplight, with the television for company, and the house settled into its nighttime version. Her hands know the needle and thread without her needing to look at them, and she watches the television and thinks various things, and occasionally says something to Robert, and occasionally he says something back. And this specific hour, the sewing in the lamplight with the television low and the children asleep and the dishes done, this is perhaps the most genuinely quiet part of her day. The part that most closely resembles what the magazines and the programs would have called rest. Whether it is actually rest is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Let me say something honest about what I find most remarkable and most complicated about this woman's day, because I want to be careful not to reduce it to either the cheerful mythology or the grim corrective. Both of those versions miss something important. The work Margaret did, from 6 in the morning until 8 o'clock at night, was real work. It was skilled, it was physical, it was constant, and it was invisible in the specific way that domestic labor has always been invisible. Its quality is noticed only when it fails, when the shirt is wrinkled, when the dinner is late, when the bathroom isn't clean. When it is done correctly, it produces what everyone around it experiences as simply normalcy. The family is fed, the house is clean, the children are dressed, the day runs, and running is mistaken, repeatedly and across decades, for running on its own. But I also want to say this. Margaret is not a victim. That framing misses her. She is a person of considerable competence, operating in the domain she was given with a skill and care that deserves to be called, without irony, mastery. She knows things about running a household that most people today have never learned and could not quickly acquire. She knows the difference between a gravy that will hold and a gravy that will break. She knows how to cut a garment's collar so it lies flat. She knows which of her children's moods needs words, and which needs cookies, and which needs 45 minutes outside. She knows, without being told, that there is a specific order to the Monday wash, and that violating it produces worse results. These are forms of knowledge, real ones, that they were uncompensated, unremarked, unrecognized as the specialized professional skills they actually were. That is the tragedy, not the woman herself. The story is not, she was trapped. The story is, she was remarkable, and the remarkable was rendered invisible by the system that required it. There is something else I want to tell you about, which is the social geography of the neighborhood and what it meant for a woman like Margaret. She was not alone all day. I want to be clear about that, because the image of the isolated suburban housewife, solitary in her kitchen, cut off from human connection by the design of post-war suburbs, is true in some dimensions and not true in others. She was alone in the house, yes, for most of the day, but the neighborhood was a social structure, and she was embedded in it, and the embedding was a constant, low-level presence in her day. The coffee clatch. This is an institution worth explaining, because it is one of those things that sounds slight from the outside and meant considerably more from the inside. 2 or 3 mornings a week, in various configurations, the women of the neighborhood gathered in one kitchen or another for coffee. Not a scheduled formal gathering, something more fluid than that, an organic assembly governed by who was home and whose door was open and who needed to get out of her own house for an hour. Margaret's neighbor on the left, a woman named Dorothy who had 3 children under 6 and a husband who worked nights, had an open-door policy on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and the coffee was always on. These gatherings were not trivial. They were, for many of these women, the only context in which they could talk to adults without performing the role of wife or mother. The conversation at Dorothy's table ranged from the genuinely domestic, a recipe question, a problem with a washing machine part, a recommendation for a plumber, to things that were more interesting than any of that. What was happening in the neighborhood, what was in the news, what someone had read, what someone's mother had said, what someone thought about the election or the schools, or the growing consensus about what women were and were not supposed to want. These were smart women. Many of them had more education than their husbands. Several had worked before marriage, at offices, at schools, at shops, and had the professional intelligence to prove it. The kitchen table at Dorothy's house on a Tuesday morning was, in its own way, a kind of salon, though nobody would have used that word. But the coffee clatch had a shadow side, and it is worth being honest about that too. The same social network that provided connection and relief was also the primary mechanism for monitoring and enforcing the domestic standards of the neighborhood. The women who gathered for coffee were also the women who noticed things. Whether your laundry had been out too late, whether your windows needed washing, whether your children had been sent to school in clothes that weren't quite right. The surveillance was not always conscious, not always malicious. Much of it was simply the byproduct of people who lived in close proximity and paid attention to each other. But it was real, and it exerted a genuine pressure. A 1953 study on suburban housewives, one of several conducted in that decade, as sociologists began to take an interest in what was happening in these new communities, found that women rated concern about what the neighbors think as a significant source of daily stress, more commonly reported than financial worry or marital difficulty. The neighbors were always there. The neighbors could see the windows. The neighbors might drop by. And dropping by unannounced was considered friendly, neighborly, and was done regularly, which meant that the house had to be, at all times, in a state of readiness for inspection. There is a story I read once in an oral history from this period, a woman describing the particular panic of being caught in curlers, not just uncurled hair, but actual rollers still in, the scarf around them, no lipstick, when a neighbor rang the doorbell at 11 in the morning. The woman described tearing the rollers out in the hallway, shoving them into a potted plant, trying to blot on lipstick from the tube she found in her coat pocket, answering the door flushed and slightly disheveled, and spending the rest of the visit acutely aware that her hair was wrong, and afterward feeling, in her own words, as though she had failed at something important. The feeling was out of proportion to the event, she knew, and yet she could not quite dismiss it. That is the weight of the standard. Not the standard itself, which was just a set of social expectations, but the way the standard got inside you, got into the space between a thing happening and your reaction to it, and made the reaction something larger than the thing warranted. The clothing deserves its own extended visit, because it was also a kind of labor, and its requirements were specific and physical and not optional. Margaret has a girdle. It is a boned undergarment in white cotton and elastic, and it begins at the waist and extends to mid-thigh, and she wears it every day when she leaves the house, and she has worn one every day since she turned 18. The girdle is not comfortable. It is not designed to be comfortable. It is designed to produce a smooth, controlled silhouette from waist to hip that corresponds to the fashionable line of the mid-1950s, a line that presupposes a body without any of the natural variation and movement that bodies actually have. She puts it on every morning with the resigned efficiency of someone donning necessary equipment, stepping into it and working it up her hips with both hands, smoothing the boning into place, snapping the garters to her stockings. It takes 4 minutes. She wears stockings every day. Nylon stockings, which are both a revelation compared to the cotton and silk of earlier decades, and also genuinely fragile. A caught fingernail or a snag on a rough surface produces a run, and a run renders a stocking unacceptable for public wear, and stockings are not cheap. She has a box in the drawer with several pairs in varying states of repair, some perfect, some with mended runs that she fixed with clear nail polish to stop them spreading, and one perfect pair reserved for company and church. She has also developed the particular skill of putting on stockings without running them, rolling them carefully from the toe, no rings, fingernails smooth, the same way every time. The shoes with the heel are a different kind of physical commitment. A 2-inch heel, standard for daywear, not dramatic, changes the way the foot strikes the ground, shifts the body's center of gravity forward, alters the posture. Over the course of a day that involves 7 miles walked inside one's own house, plus the shopping trip, plus the school walk, plus the dozens of moments of getting up and sitting down and moving from room to room that constitute domestic existence, the heels are a physical cost. Her feet ache by afternoon. This is known and not discussed. The dress is cotton, a shirtwaist style, fitted bodice, full skirt, belt at the waist, in a small floral print. She has 4 weekday dresses and rotates them with the laundry. It is well made, the dress. She made 2 of her 4 herself, and the quality of the seams reflects her competence. She is not, by any measurement, poorly dressed. The girdle and the heels and the set hair and the lipstick produce, when she looks in the mirror at 7:30 in the morning with the rollers out, something that corresponds precisely to what the mirror is expected to show. A young woman, well-maintained, put together, performing the role of housewife with the visual precision the role requires. She has wondered occasionally, in the specific way that questions sometimes arise without quite being invited, what she would look like without the girdle, not as a fantasy, not as a political thought, just as a plain curiosity. She does not pursue it. The house itself, let me come back to the house, because there are parts of it I have not yet described, and those parts have their own stories. The basement is where the washer lives, and also where the deep freeze lives, a chest freezer that Robert bought last fall at a considerable discount when a neighbor was clearing one out, and which Margaret regards with a somewhat mixed feeling. She likes what it can hold. She freezes bread she has baked, berries from the summer, portions of dishes she has cooked double batches of. But the deep freeze requires a kind of planning horizon that she finds slightly unnatural in the context of a life otherwise organized around the freshness and immediacy of daily shopping. You have to think about the deep freeze in advance in a way that doesn't always match how the days actually unfold. The basement also has a workbench where Robert keeps his tools and occasionally does projects. He replaced a section of the back fence last summer, a project that took 3 weekends and produced a fence section that was, Margaret thought privately, slightly off-plumb but structurally sound. She does not mention this. The basement is Robert's domain, the one part of the house where her organizational system does not operate, and she respects this boundary the way he respects her right to arrange the kitchen drawers. The attic is storage, boxes, the children's outgrown clothes, the Christmas decorations in a wooden crate labeled in her handwriting, the set of china she received as a wedding gift and uses only for major holidays, the sewing machine cabinet she has to bring downstairs when she wants to use it. The attic has a pull-down stair accessed from the hallway ceiling, and she goes up once a month or so to retrieve something, and always finds it slightly disorienting up there. The slant of the roof close overhead, the boxes piled in the order she put them in rather than any other order, the smell of dust and old paper, and the wooden frames of the house. The yard is a small rectangle behind the house with the clothesline and a square of kitchen garden Margaret started last spring. Tomatoes, zucchini, herbs, and a patch of lawn that Robert mows on weekend mornings. The tomatoes were a revelation. She grew up in an apartment and had never grown anything, and the first tomatoes from the garden, in August, warm from the vine, split slightly at the stem, tasting like nothing she had bought from a store, stayed with her as a particular kind of discovery about what food could be when it had come from nowhere but the ground 20 feet from her kitchen door. She canned them. She canned the surplus tomatoes in late August, standing over the canning pot in the kitchen in the heat of a late summer afternoon, processing jars according to the procedure in her ball blue book of preserving, the timing, the seal, the water bath, and setting them in rows on the basement shelf with a strip of masking tape, labeling each jar with the date and contents in her precise handwriting. She did this for 3 weekends in a row while it was still tomato season, and ended up with 32 jars of whole tomatoes and 12 of crushed, which she has been opening throughout the winter with a satisfaction that she finds difficult to put into words. It is not just the tomatoes. It is the planning, the work, the long shelf in the basement. The winter opened with a jar lid, and the smell of August released in the kitchen in January. It is the competence of having made something last. This is a strand of Margaret's character that the broader cultural narrative about 1950s housewives tends to miss. The satisfaction of mastery, the genuine pleasure of making things well. She is not performing competence for an audience, or not only that, she takes real pride in the cornbread when it comes out right, in the canning operation executed cleanly, in the dress that fits Patty perfectly without a wrinkle at the shoulder. These are her achievements in the domain she has been given, and she claims them with the quiet authority of someone who earned them. The culture of the era had a name for this, though the name was ideological in a way the thing itself was not. It was called home-making, and it was presented in magazines and on television and in the speeches of the era as a vocation, a calling, something that elevated the domestic to the sacred. Margaret received this framing with a somewhat ambivalent response she did not entirely examine. On one hand, she did regard what she did as important, genuinely important, and being told it was important felt like being seen. On the other hand, there was something in the framing that felt slightly off, a little too eager to reassure, as though the reassurance was coming from someone who was worried they needed to provide it. The magazines were remarkable documents of this ambivalence, when you read them with an eye to what was happening beneath the recipes and the home decorating tips. Good Housekeeping, McCall's, Ladies' Home Journal. These were sophisticated publications with genuinely good writing in them, and the writing, especially in the personal essays and the advice columns, occasionally broke through the approved message in ways that read, 60 years later, as almost deliberately subversive. There was an article in McCall's in 1956, I want to say the year is right, I might be slightly off, that asked more or less directly whether the housewife was happy, not whether she was good at her work, whether she was happy, and the answer the article was forced to give, because it had done the research and talked to actual women, was complicated enough that the editorial staff had clearly argued about how to run it. Women were not uniformly unhappy. That would be too simple. but they were, in significant numbers, reporting to researchers a particular experience that would not get a name for another several years when Betty Friedan called it, in a book that landed like a stone in a still pond, The Problem That Has No Name, a sense of, she described it variously, the women who experienced it, something missing, some not quite rightness, some private awareness that the role, for all its genuine demands and genuine satisfactions, did not fill the whole space of what they were, that there was something else in there, some capacity or desire or need that was going unaddressed by even the most perfect cornbread and the most smoothly ironed shirt. Some women pushed this awareness away. It was dangerous, in the social vocabulary of 1953, to acknowledge wanting more than the domestic life promised. Women who wanted more were called gently by their friends, less gently by others, difficult, unfeminine, not quite right, ambitious in the way that was coded as a warning. Some women channeled it into the coffee clatch conversations, letting it surface sideways in discussions of books they'd read or questions they'd heard asked. Some women found it in church, or in the particular sustained attention of raising their children, or in the garden Margaret grows behind the house. Some women, and this is the part that makes me genuinely sad when I sit with it, some women medicated it. The 1950s were the era of the housewife's little yellow pill, tranquilizers, prescribed by doctors who saw anxious, unhappy women and determined that the right response was to make them less anxious, rather than to ask what they were anxious about. The prescription rate for tranquilizers in the United States rose dramatically through the late 1950s, and the demographic most represented in those prescriptions was women between the ages of 25 and 40. Margaret does not take tranquilizers. She has not been to the doctor about this particular subject. She is not sure she has a subject that would describe itself that way. What she has is quieter than that, less defined. It is the question she thinks sometimes at the kitchen window with the second cup of coffee, the one that doesn't quite form a sentence before she turns back to what she was doing. It is the way she holds the book in the kitchen drawer under the dish towels, reading when she can, feeling the reading as something slightly secret and therefore slightly necessary. But I am getting ahead of where we are in the day. Let me come back to the evening. After the sewing, after the television, Robert puts down his newspaper and suggests going to bed at 9:45, which is their usual time. She folds the sewing into the basket, threads the needle neatly into the pincushion, clips the light. She will check the children before she sleeps. She does this every night, a quiet walk to their room, standing in the doorway for a moment in the dark to listen to their breathing, which is one of the specific, unrepeatable sounds of her life. In the bathroom, she has her own routine. Cold cream removed with cotton wool. She has her mother's skin, which means she takes care of it the way her mother taught her. Cold cream to cleanse, a little toner, a rich night cream she buys at the drugstore. She pins her hair back into the rollers for tomorrow's set, 20 rollers all in place, the scarf tied. She brushes her teeth. She looks at herself in the mirror, the familiar version, the bare face, the rollers, the flannel nightgown with the buttons at the throat. This is the face she shows to no one but Robert, and this is the face that is actually hers, not constructed, not maintained, not performing anything. She finds it, on most nights, adequate. Sometimes on bad days she finds it tired. Occasionally, on good days, she finds it simply her own, and that is enough. The bed is made, as it has been since morning, the fresh sheets pulled tight, the cuff of the top sheet folded back. She gets in on the left side. The room is cool enough for the blanket. Robert reads for a while. He is a thriller reader, fast and absorbed, and she lies beside him in the dark with her eyes open, running through the day in the way that seems to happen automatically, not with anxiety but with a kind of taking stock, what was done, what needs doing tomorrow, whether the birthday card for Robert's mother needs to go out this week, which it does, whether there is enough flour for the baking she planned for Friday, whether Patty's cold is coming or going, and also, underneath these practical things, the day itself, its texture, its specific moments, Patty's hair being braided, The look on Thomas's face when he made her laugh at dinner, the tomatoes on the vines when she checked them yesterday morning, the particular smell of the pork chops when they came out of the oven. These are hers. These are the things nobody names and nobody counts and nobody compensates, but they are the substance of the day, and they are hers, and she holds them briefly in the quiet before sleep. The light on Robert's side goes off. The room is dark. Outside, in the yards and streets of the neighborhood, everything is settled for the night. The grass is damp from the evening's cooling. Someone's dog has stopped barking. The light at the corner, the one that flickers slightly, is doing its patient flickering work in the empty street. The washing machine that she ran this morning has long since been turned off. The clothes on the line, she took them in at 4 before she started cooking, are folded and stacked on the dining room chairs for tomorrow's ironing. The kitchen smells faintly of the night's dinner, a good smell, a home smell, and the linoleum is clean, and the cast-iron skillet is oiled and hanging on its hook. She sleeps. There are things I have not yet told you about Margaret's world, about the specific and complicated texture of a 1950s housewife's life that do not fit neatly into the sequence of a single day. Some of them sit in the wider social and economic structure around her, and I want to take some time with them now, because they are important, and because understanding them changes how you see everything else. The money. Let's start there. Margaret does not have a bank account in her own name. This is not a choice she made, or a condition she finds especially notable, because it is simply the arrangement, the default, unremarkable arrangement of a married woman's financial life in 1953 in most of the United States. The bank account is Robert's. The credit, the installment plan for the furniture, the account at the hardware store is Robert's. If Margaret were for any reason to need to make a financial transaction in her own right, she would need his signature, his presence, or his account number. She could not, in most states, obtain a credit card in her own name without a husband or male relative to co-sign. She could not take out a mortgage without the same. The money that she manages, and she manages it carefully, the household budget being one of her genuine areas of expertise, is not technically hers in the legal sense, even as she stretches it and allocates it and makes the decisions that make it stretch. Robert is not domineering about this. He trusts her with the household money and doesn't audit her decisions, which is not universal. Some of her neighbors' husbands demanded an accounting of every expenditure, which was its own particular form of management. Robert gives her the housekeeping money on Fridays and she makes it work, and if there is a major purchase she thinks they should make, she raises it with him and they discuss it. And this, in the grammar of 1953, is a good arrangement. It is. She is not unhappy with it. And yet is the thing. The awareness, somewhere in the background, that the money flowing through her hands each week, being turned into the food and the clothing and the managed household and the children's school supplies and the flowers on the dinner table, that it is not hers in any formal sense, that if something happened, if the marriage ended or Robert became ill, or any of the contingencies that a woman's mind turns over at 3 in the morning, she would have very limited options. The options are not nothing. She had a job before they married, a secretarial position at an insurance company where Robert, as it happens, also worked, which is how they met. She could, in principle, return to work, but the path back was not simple. It involved giving up the domestic role that was the organizing principle of her life, giving up the children's daily care to someone else, giving up the social standing that came with being a full-time housewife in a neighborhood where full-time housewifery was the standard. She does not spend much time thinking about this. It would be exhausting, and she is already tired. But the thought is there, the way a draft is there in a house with thin walls, not constant, not disabling, but perceptible under certain conditions. There is one more thing worth taking time with, and it is connected to the money but also separate from it, and it is the question of what the world expected from Margaret in terms of who she was and who she was allowed to be. She graduated from high school at 17 with good marks. She had 1 year of secretarial school, typing, shorthand, the procedural knowledge of office work, and then went to work. She was good at her job. Her supervisor told her more than once that she was organized and quick, that she had a natural precision with paperwork, that she had potential, whatever that word meant in 1951. She worked for 3 years, until the year she and Robert married, and then she stopped, because that was what happened when you got married. You stopped. It was not a rule, technically, but it was thoroughly understood. A married woman with a working husband did not continue to work unless there was a specific financial necessity, because her working would imply that her husband couldn't provide, and a man who couldn't provide had a certain kind of social problem. Some women worked anyway, quietly, out of genuine economic need, and the economic need was usually legible enough that it provided cover. But Margaret did not need to work. Robert provided. And so she came home to the house with the yellow shutters and began the career that I have been describing to you all night. The skills she carried from the secretarial work, the organization, the precision, the systematic approach to complex tasks are everywhere in her domestic life, though no one has connected them as such. The meal planning that runs in the back of her mind while she is doing other things is a form of project management. The household budget she maintains in a small ledger in the kitchen drawer is bookkeeping. The management of 2 children's schedules, needs, moods, and developmental arcs is human resources of a kind. These are recognizable professional competencies deployed in a context that rendered them invisible as professional competencies and visible only as housewifely correctness. She is too busy to think about this with any sustained attention, but occasionally a version of it surfaces, the way things surface when you are tired and the house is quiet and the day has finally run its course. There is something else I want to hold for a moment before we go further, which is the question of what joy looked like in Margaret's daily life, because I want to be clear that it was there, and I want to be specific about where. It was in the garden in the late afternoon, when the light came from the west and fell across the tomatoes in a way that made each one look slightly lit from within. She had not known she was a gardener until she put things in the ground and they grew, and the growing still surprised her, the way the green shoots appeared before she expected them, and the fruit formed and ripened on a schedule that had nothing to do with her planning. It was in the particular sound of her children laughing, not the polite laughter of children performing for adults, the real laughter, the helpless kind, that happened when Thomas chased Patty through the house with a garden hose, and neither of them could stop. It was in the library book. Always in the library book, whichever one it was. She moved through books with the attention of someone for whom reading was genuinely essential, not ornamental, not an intellectual performance, but necessary in the way that eating was necessary. She had a whole interior life that ran on books, a set of ideas and images and stories that she carried around inside her and that informed how she saw things, and this interior life was entirely her own. Nobody managed it. Nobody had an opinion about it. It was hers. It was in the sewing. Not every project, but the ones that came together the way they were supposed to. The collar lying flat, the seams meeting evenly, the finished garment looking, when she held it up, like something she could be proud of. The dress for Patty, the curtains she made herself, the knowledge, physical and certain, that she had made a thing that would last. And it was, I want to say this carefully, because it is easy to misread, it was also in the running of the household itself, in the best hours of it, not the grinding parts, not the invisibility, not the physical exhaustion or the social surveillance or the financial dependence, but the actual craft of it, the management of the day's moving parts, the assembly of a dinner that worked, the household running at the particular frequency that corresponded to everything being done right. In those hours it felt, and I believe she was not wrong to feel this, like competence given the respect it deserved. Now let me tell you about some of the specific technologies and materials of Margaret's kitchen world, because they are genuinely interesting, and because the food culture of the 1950s was undergoing one of the most rapid transformations in American culinary history, and she was standing right in the middle of it. The refrigerator changed everything about food, though not overnight and not uniformly. The household that Margaret grew up in had an icebox, a literal box insulated with cork and cooled by a block of ice delivered several times a week by the Iceman, whose route was as regular and known as the mailman's. The refrigerator her parents eventually got was a revelation, a domestic miracle, and Margaret grew up with the assumption that electric refrigeration was a fundamental household amenity, rather than the recent invention it actually was. For her own mother's generation, the implications of reliable refrigeration, keeping milk fresh for days rather than hours, keeping leftovers safely, buying protein in larger quantities than could be consumed at one meal, were enormous and still being absorbed. For Margaret, the refrigerator was simply a given, but she was living through the secondary wave of its effects, the transformation of what was considered possible and expected in a daily diet. With reliable refrigeration came the expectation of fresh ingredients on a daily basis, the expectation of variety in what was served, the expectation of the kind of multi-course dinner she produces most evenings. The refrigerator enabled the elaborate cooking, and the elaborate cooking then became the standard against which she was measured. The canned goods on her pantry shelf represent an older layer of the story. The tin can had been transforming the American kitchen for decades before Margaret was born, and the variety available by 1953 was substantial. Canned tomatoes, canned corn, canned fruit, canned soup. Campbell's was already a household institution. Canned tuna, canned evaporated milk, canned beans. She used canned goods regularly and without embarrassment. They were part of the mid-century housewife's standard toolkit, and the stigma attached to convenience food that would develop in later decades had not yet fully formed. The casserole was the apotheosis of this, a dish that combined a protein, usually canned or fresh, with a vegetable, usually canned, and a starch, usually cooked separately, and a sauce, often based on a can of cream of mushroom soup, which functioned in the 1950s kitchen as something close to a universal binder, and baked them together into a dish that was hot, filling, economical, and required minimal active preparation. Margaret makes casseroles. She makes tuna noodle casserole with cream of mushroom soup and crushed Ritz crackers on top, which comes out golden and bubbling, and which both children eat without complaint. She makes a green bean casserole with fried onions from a can on top, which appeared in a recipe on the Campbell's soup label a few years ago, and which she has made a dozen times since. She makes a chicken and rice casserole with cream of chicken soup and frozen peas. The frozen peas are new in her kitchen, a concession to the bird's eye display at the grocery store, and she has to admit they are convenient. She makes these dishes without apology, and usually with genuine pleasure in the practical satisfaction of them. She also makes things from scratch that no shortcut yet existed for. The braised pork chops, the cornbread, the coleslaw dressing, the soups in winter that start from a stock she makes herself from whatever bones she's accumulated in the refrigerator, simmered for hours with onion and celery and bay leaf. These are the dishes she is proudest of, the ones that require real judgment and real taste. But she does not draw a philosophical line between the canned soup casserole and the braised pork chops. They are both food she made for her family, and they both served their purposes, and the distinction between convenience and craft that will become so important to later food culture had not yet organized itself in her kitchen. The Jell-O mold was another 1950s fixture, and it is perhaps the emblem most associated with the era's food culture in the popular imagination. The lime green gelatin with mandarin oranges suspended in it, the strawberry ring mold filled with cream cheese, these seem slightly absurd today, and I think we can acknowledge that without being unkind about it, they were the result of a genuine technology. Flavored gelatin was a product that required refrigeration to set and transport, and so it became, in the refrigeration era, a kind of status food, something that demonstrated you had the equipment to make it properly. The women who brought Jell-O molds to church suppers in the 1950s were bringing evidence of modernity in a modest way. A properly set, well-shaped molded gelatin took skill and required planning. The ratios had to be right, the mold had to be oiled, the unmolding had to be timed and executed carefully. There was craft in it, the way there is craft in any technical process, that the aesthetic result looks dated to modern eyes, says something about how food fashions move, not about whether there was competence involved in making it. Margaret makes a jello mold when company is coming. She uses orange jello with canned fruit cocktail, set in a ring mold that she turns out onto a plate of lettuce leaves. It is not her most ambitious dish, but it is reliable, and it is recognizable to her guests as a gesture of effort, and that recognition is part of the social transaction of hosting in 1953. Let me talk about what happened to Margaret when she was sick. It happened twice last winter, once in November, a respiratory thing that put her to bed for 3 days with a fever and a cough, once in January, a stomach thing that lasted 2 days. Both times she was sick in the same house with the same family and the same obligations, and being sick did not remove the obligations. Robert could manage breakfast for himself and the children, though his breakfasts were rougher than hers, and the children ate cereal instead of hot food, and the kitchen was in a state when he was done that would have required attention under normal circumstances. He took the children to school. He picked them up. He warmed things from the freezer for dinner. He was, she will say this plainly, actually quite good in a crisis, better than she sometimes expected, which says something about the assumptions she carried about what he could and couldn't do. But she did not rest the way a sick person might rest, because her mind kept running the household even while her body was in bed. She thought about the laundry that was piling up, about the school picture forms that needed to go back, about whether Robert knew where the children's doctor's number was. She directed things from the bed, and Robert went back and forth, and the household managed imperfectly but adequately, and by the 4th day she was on her feet again, and things snapped back into their normal running order, with a speed that was itself slightly revealing about what the normal running order required. Nobody asked her if she was okay, not in the deep sense, not in the way that would have required a real answer. She was asked if she was feeling better, which she said she was, which was close enough to true that the distinction didn't seem worth making. Here is something about the evenings in Margaret's house that I haven't told you yet, which is that the evenings were also not as simple as they looked. The television was on by 7 most nights, and the family gathered around it with varying degrees of attention. Robert watched it seriously. The evening news, which he watched without speaking, and with an expression of focused concern that Margaret had learnt to read as his watching the news face and to leave alone. The children watched their programs, Howdy Doody in the earlier years, now increasingly the shows aimed at families, The Lone Ranger, Lassie. She watched sometimes, and sometimes she sewed through it, and sometimes she was in the kitchen finishing something, and the television sound came to her through the wall as a kind of audio company. What television was doing to family life in the 1950s was a question that sociologists were already asking with some urgency, because the speed of adoption had been extraordinary, from barely any sets in American homes in 1950 to the majority by the end of the decade, and the social effects were visible even to people without a social science training. The family gathered in the living room in the evenings, as families had gathered before, but now the gathering had an object, a focal point, an attention-organizing device that had not been there before. The conversation that happened across the dinner table, or in the few hours between dinner and bed, had to compete with the screen, and the screen had production values. Margaret is not sure what she thinks about the television. She appreciates certain programs. She watched I Love Lucy from the beginning, and found it genuinely funny in a way she felt slightly guilty about, because Lucy Ricardo was always doing the thing a housewife was not supposed to do, wanting something beyond the house, conspiring to get it, getting it wrong, and the comedy was built on Lucy's failure, but something in Margaret responded to Lucy's desire before it responded to her failure. The wanting, the not quite containment of a personality that was too large for the frame the role provided. She never said this to anyone. It would have been a difficult thing to say in 1953, in the neighborhood with the yellow shutters and the well-ironed shirts and the perfect coleslaw in the refrigerator. The decade was coming to its midpoint, and just beyond the picture-perfect lawns and the gleaming kitchen appliances and the pressed cotton dresses, something was stirring, not in the neighborhood, not yet, not loudly, not in a way that would arrive as a named movement for another decade, but in the small pressures that accumulate invisibly in a closed system, in the prescription rates, in the letters women wrote to the advice columnists that the columnists were increasingly unsure how to answer, in the reading group that met at Dorothy's house twice a month and had started a few months ago to read things besides recipes and home decorating advice, in the particular quality of certain conversations at the coffee clatch when the topic drifted, carefully, slightly nervously, in a direction nobody quite named, in Margaret's library book in the kitchen drawer, in the question she didn't finish forming at the kitchen window in the morning, in the letter she received last spring from a woman she'd worked with at the insurance company, who was still working, who had a particular quality in her letters, a directness, a sense of occupying her own life with full physical presence, that Margaret sometimes held the letters up and read again after she had already read them once. She is not unhappy. I want to say that clearly, because I have spent a long time in her kitchen and I do not want to make her into a figure of uncomplicated sadness, which would be its own kind of unfairness. She loves her children with the particular, animal, non-negotiable love of a mother who has held them since they were small and understands their specific selves. She loves the work she is good at in the way that any skilled person loves the honest exercise of their skill. She loves the garden and the books and the sewing. She loves Robert, even across the formal architecture of their marriage, even in the particular way that 1953 love had to be expressed, which was not quite the way she might have designed it herself, but was real. What she is in possession of more capacity than her current life quite uses. The intelligence that ran her office work efficiently for 3 years, the organizational competence that manages a household and 2 children with a smoothness that looks like ease, the interior life that keeps itself going on 2 cups of coffee a day and a library book under the dish towels. All of this is hers. All of it is more than the role has room for, in ways she perceives dimly and does not quite pursue. In a few years, a book will come out and name what she feels. She will read it in fragments, at the kitchen table, the way she reads everything, in the gaps when nobody needs anything, when the house is quiet and the work is done. She will not have a simple response to it. It will be more complicated than agreement, more complicated than disagreement. It will be the specific feeling of being recognized after a very long time of not being recognized, which is its own particular experience, not quite relief and not quite grief, something in between that doesn't have a clean name, but that is not yet. That is 1963. For now it is 1953, and the neighborhood is quiet, and the light at the corner is doing its patient flickering, and the chrysanthemums along the front walk are done for the season, and will need to be cut back before the frost, and Margaret is asleep in the house with the yellow shutters, in the cool dark room, the rollers in her hair, her face bare, her hands folded on the blanket, and the day complete. She will wake before the alarm. She always does. Let me tell you a few more things before this night is over, not to extend the day, but to fill in the picture a little more, the details that sit around the edges of the main story, and give it its full texture. The neighbours, we have mentioned them but not fully entered their world, which was really Margaret's world too, her primary social context, the community she lived in, and the source of both genuine connection and genuine pressure. The woman on the left is Dorothy, who we have met briefly, the one with the open-door coffee policy and the 3 children under 6. Dorothy is 26 and has a quality Margaret admires and slightly envies. She is funny. She is funny in the particular way of someone who sees the absurdity in things and can name it in a sentence. She makes Margaret laugh at the kitchen table on Tuesday mornings in ways that make the hour feel different. She also has genuine troubles that she keeps mostly to herself. Her husband works nights at the plant, which means the household runs on his schedule even more completely than most. which means she is genuinely on her own with 3 small children from 7 at night until 7 in the morning, and the exhaustion she carries is real even when the humor is also real. They talk without ever quite saying the harder things, which is the register most close female friendships of this era operated in: proximity without full disclosure, warmth without the particular risk of full honesty. The woman on the right is Helen, who is 43, and whose children are in high school, and whose husband works for the phone company, and who has taken to coming to Margaret's back door in the late afternoons on no particular schedule to sit for 20 minutes and talk about, well, about everything. Helen is the neighborhood's unofficial historian and social archivist. She knows who has lived in every house on the street and who moved away and why, and she conveys this information with a particular combination of warmth and judgment that Margaret has learned to receive at a slight calibrated distance. Helen means well. Helen also judges. She does not fully separate these two modes, and perhaps does not entirely see them as separate. Across the street at the diagonal is the family that moved in 6 months ago, a couple named Frank and Evelyn with a baby. Evelyn is from Georgia, which is legible in her vowels and in the particular formality of her hospitality. The way she offers coffee with a seriousness that suggests she has thought about the coffee, about the cup, about the small pitcher of cream on the side. Margaret likes her. They have had coffee twice, officially, with the silver tray and the good cups, and once informally in Evelyn's kitchen, which was the better visit by some margin, the one where the conversation went somewhere genuine. Evelyn had a college degree from a small school in Georgia. She mentioned it once, briefly, almost in apology, which was the way women mentioned education in 1953, as though it might be taken as criticism of the current arrangement. Margaret has a year of secretarial school and a competence that would have looked excellent on a transcript if she'd been given the category to put it in. The neighborhood also includes 2 women, Margaret knows them less well, who are quietly different from the domestic housewife template in ways she registers without analyzing. One who clearly runs more of the household finances than the standard arrangement would suggest, whose husband seems cheerfully uninterested in the specifics, and one who has a friend who comes on Thursday afternoons and stays for dinner. The kind of friend whose presence in the house is never quite explained to Margaret's understanding. She does not ask, it is not her business, and there is something in her, a quality of live and let live that she may have inherited from her own mother, who was a practical woman, that makes the ambiguity comfortable rather than threatening. The neighborhood's social life had 2 primary official registers, the church and the neighborhood association meeting that happened quarterly in the church hall. Margaret and Robert attend Sunday services at the Lutheran church 3 blocks away, where the children go to Sunday school, and where Margaret is on the flower committee, which is a small voluntary role that consists mainly of making sure the altar flowers are fresh on Sundays and coordinating the order. It is not demanding. It puts her in contact with a different network of women than the street-level network, women from across the broader community who are not necessarily her neighbors, and she finds this valuable in the way that slightly different company is always valuable. It shifts the register of conversation slightly, introduces new information, gives her something to compare against. The quarterly neighborhood association meetings were a source of recurring low-grade entertainment in the neighborhood, which Margaret would not have said aloud but thought clearly. They were ostensibly about things like street lighting and whether the Development Association should allow certain kinds of outbuildings and the maintenance of the common greenway at the back of the lots. In practice, they were an occasion for various long-standing neighborhood opinions to be given formal air, and for Frank from across the street, who had a quality of civic engagement that seemed slightly theatrical, to hold the floor for extended periods on topics that could have been resolved in sentences. Margaret attended, because not attending would be noted, and she was not interested in being noted, and she sat in the metal folding chairs in the church hall and watched the proceedings with an expression of polite attention that concealed a perfectly functioning interior monologue. Now let me tell you about what happened to the house itself in the course of a season, because the housewife's labor was not only daily, there were larger cycles, weeks-long projects that occurred seasonally and represented an additional layer of the work that the daily routine rested upon. Spring cleaning. The tradition is ancient and has its own logic. The house was opened after winter, the accumulated close-season dust dealt with, the windows finally washed with the full attention they deserved, the mattresses aired, the rugs beaten, the interior thoroughly reorganized and refreshed. Margaret did spring cleaning in late March or early April, over the course of about 10 days, working room by room in an order she had inherited from her mother. Kitchen first, then bathroom, then main living areas, then bedrooms, then basement. The kitchen spring cleaning meant pulling everything out of every cabinet, the good dishes from the top cabinet, the pots from the bottom, the various back-of-the-shelf items that had migrated during the year, and washing the cabinet interiors with hot soapy water and relining the shelves with fresh shelf paper and replacing everything in an order she had reconsidered and sometimes revised. The windows were done on a good dry day, vinegar in a bucket of warm water, a chamois for the panes, newspaper for the final polish. The newspaper left no lint, which was the reason for it. She had tried cloth and been unsatisfied with the result. The window washing took all of a full morning, inside and out, and when she was done the light in the house was different, cleaner, more present, the kind of light that shows the surfaces clearly and makes everything look slightly more deliberate. The rugs in spring were beaten on the clothesline with a long-handled wire rug beater, which produced a deeply satisfying quantity of dust and left the rugs genuinely clean in a way that even the best vacuuming did not quite accomplish. You understood, after beating a rug, why the expression beating a rug existed, because the beater against the rug made a sound like a decision, something firm and conclusive, and the clouds of dust confirmed that something real was being removed. The fall brought its own version, the storm windows going on the regular windows, which was Robert's job on a Saturday in October. The garden being cut back and put to bed, which was hers. The heavier curtains replacing the summer shears, the wool blankets coming out of their cedar storage and airing on the line for a day before going on the beds. There was a particular smell to the transition from summer to fall housekeeping that Margaret found oddly moving. The cedar smell of the stored blankets combined with the cold air smell of an October day and the garden smell of cut-back vegetation. It was the smell of the year closing down, preparing for the smaller inward season. Christmas. The holiday represented for Margaret a full amplification of everything that was already true about her daily work. More cooking, more planning, more physical labor, more social performances, more invisible management of multiple simultaneous requirements, all against a deadline that was both immovable and charged with emotional weight. She began planning for Christmas in early November, because to begin later was to court the particular anxiety of the unfinished, the gifts not bought, the cards not written, the cookies not baked, the table not set. The Christmas cards alone were a project. She sent cards to 42 households. Each card was personally signed with a note of some kind, sometimes only a sentence, sometimes more for people she was close to, and addressed in her careful handwriting and stamped and mailed in a window between December 15th and December 20th that represented the correct timing, not too early, too eager, and not too late, disorganized. The card list was maintained in a small address book she kept in the kitchen drawer alongside the library book, updated each year as addresses changed. The baking started in early December. Rolled sugar cookies cut into stars and trees and bells, decorated with the coloured sugar that Patty and Thomas were allowed to help apply, which was genuinely their favourite part of Christmas preparations and which Margaret staged as a project rather than an imposition, spreading out the newspaper on the table, setting out the sugar in small bowls, giving each child their own cookies to decorate, and allowing the results to be as chaotic as they needed to be. The resulting cookies were not technically beautiful. They were covered in approximately as much coloured sugar as 2 enthusiastic children could apply in 20 minutes, which was a great deal. She ate them with the full appreciation they deserved. The dinner on Christmas Day was the year's major performance. the meal at which she deployed everything she knew, the standing rib roast that she ordered from Mr. Davies in advance, the mashed potatoes, the creamed onions that nobody particularly liked except Robert's mother, who always requested them, the sweet potatoes with the marshmallows on top that the children insisted on, the green beans, the cranberry sauce she made from scratch with a can of whole cranberries and orange zest and a little sugar. The table was set with the good china, the silver that came from Robert's grandmother, and that she polished the week before with silver cream and a soft cloth, the good linen tablecloth she had received as a wedding gift and kept only for major occasions, the candles, the flowers, in December, hothouse carnations, available at the florist's on the high street, expensive but worth it. 8 people at the table, usually. Robert's parents, who drove from the next town over and arrived at noon and stayed until 8, which was both a pleasure and a management challenge. Her own mother, widowed in 1949, who was brought by her brother and his wife, and who was wonderful company and extraordinarily helpful in the kitchen, which Margaret accepted with gratitude and without ceremony. Robert's brother and his wife, who had no children yet, and who were in the particular early stage of their marriage, where they were very carefully watching the template and attempting to reproduce it. Margaret cooked most of Christmas from before anyone arrived to after most people had left, with breaks for eating and for the distribution of gifts to the children, which happened after dinner and which was the hour she liked best in the whole day. Thomas and Patty in their pajamas on the living room floor, surrounded by the specific paper and ribbon disorder of opened presents, their faces doing the particular thing that children's faces do in the presence of something anticipated and finally received. Robert's mother photographed it with a Brownie camera. Some of those photographs still exist, in Margaret's photo album, in the basement in a box labelled in her handwriting. They show children, and a living room, and a tree with its lights, and at the edge of the frame, often, a woman in an apron with a pleased expression, half turned toward the kitchen because there is still something on the stove. There is always still something on the stove. There are weekly rhythms that I want to trace before we go any further, because the housewife's labor was not uniform across the days of the week. Each day had its own character, its own primary task, and the organization of the week into these distinct domestic stations was itself a kind of inherited system passed down from mother to daughter across generations, adapted for the era, adjusted for the appliances and the neighborhood and the particular family's needs, but recognizable in its bones from decades before. Monday was wash day, as we have established, but Tuesday was ironing, and the ironing was its own particular world. Wednesday in Margaret's house was the day she baked. This was a practice she had observed in her mother's kitchen and had reproduced without, as far as she could tell, ever consciously deciding to. It was simply Wednesday, and Wednesday was the day you baked. She baked bread most Wednesdays, 2 loaves of white bread in the bread pans, rising twice before they went in the oven, filling the kitchen with the yeast smell that she associated more with warmth and safety than with any specific memory, though she could trace the association clearly if she tried. Her mother's kitchen on Wednesday mornings, the bowl of rising dough covered with a dish towel, the specific patience required, the way the yeast smell changed as the bread went from raw to baked, sharpening and sweetening simultaneously. She had made her first loaves of bread at 11, standing beside her mother at the kitchen counter, and the loaves were small and slightly dense from overworking the dough, and her mother had eaten them with butter and said they were very good, which was the particular generosity of a mother who understood that the real result was the skill being built, not the specific loaf. She also baked cookies on Wednesday, usually, because having cookies in the tin meant the children coming home from school could be met with something that felt like abundance, the particular easy happiness of fresh cookies still slightly warm. Chocolate chip was the standard, from the recipe on the back of the Toll House package. This recipe had been in broad circulation since the 1930s and had achieved the status of a fixed point in the American baking universe, a thing everyone recognized and everyone made, and everyone felt slightly proprietorial about in terms of the particular variations they used. Margaret added an extra half teaspoon of vanilla, which she'd seen her aunt do and which she was convinced produced a better result, though she had never done a direct comparison. Wednesday baking also sometimes included the weekly cake, if company was expected over the weekend or if she was contributing to something at church. She made a reliable yellow cake with chocolate frosting, the frosting made from cocoa and butter and powdered sugar and a little milk, beaten until it was smooth and dark and just barely soft enough to spread without tearing the cake surface. She made it from the recipe card in the box that lived in the kitchen drawer, the box of recipe cards she'd been accumulating for 10 years, some in her own handwriting, some in her mother's, some clipped from magazines and pasted onto index cards, some transcribed from a neighbor's verbal instructions with her own marginal notes about what had and hadn't worked. That recipe box was, in its own way, a kind of archive, a record of the decade's cooking life, of what was tried and what was kept, of the food culture's gradual shifts from the spare, wartime-influenced cooking of the early 1940s, when the recipes were collected, toward the slightly more abundant and elaborated versions of the mid-1950s prosperity. She had a recipe for a victory cake from 1944 that used no butter and minimal sugar, adapted for ration restrictions, and looking at it now, the specifications seemed almost ascetic. She kept it. It was history. Thursday was the day the house got the thorough treatment beyond the Monday basics. The tub scrubbed, the woodwork wiped, the mirrors polished with vinegar water, the silver, not the good silver, but the everyday silver pieces, the salt and pepper shakers, the butter dish, polished back to brightness. Thursday was also the day she paid whatever bills needed paying, which meant sitting at the kitchen table with Robert's checkbook, technically his checkbook, though she maintained it, and the household ledger, and working through the month's accumulated invoices with the careful, methodical attention she brought to any numerical task. The household ran on a budget that was thin but workable, and working it required the kind of close attention to small variations. This week's grocery bill slightly higher because of the roast, this week's utility bill slightly lower because October had been mild, that most people would now describe as meticulous financial tracking. In 1953 it was just called running the house. Friday was the day Robert got paid. He brought home his check on Friday afternoons, and they had developed a Friday ritual around this. He handed her the check, she thanked him, he took $20 for his personal expenses for the week, and the rest went to the household fund. This exchange, unremarkable in practice, was the weekly financial reset, the moment when the theoretical budget became actual money, and Margaret always felt a faint release in it, not because she was anxious about money exactly, but because she was responsible for it, and responsibility has its own particular weight that lifts briefly when the resource arrives to meet it. Saturday was the family day, the one day in the week when the normal structure softened slightly. Robert was home, which changed the texture of everything. The kitchen felt different with him in it. The house had a different energy, less focused and organized, more ambient and companionable. The children were home and louder and more present, and the weekend had a particular kind of productive disorder that she could not have maintained all week but genuinely enjoyed for 2 days. She still cooked, she still cleaned, though at a slightly lower standard than weekday cleaning, but the baking on Saturday morning, with the radio on and Robert reading at the table and the children in the yard or on the living room floor, that had a quality that weekday baking didn't quite reach. Sunday was church and the Sunday dinner, which was the week's ceremonial meal even in a week with no company. The Sunday dinner was a roast or a whole chicken, always, something that went in the oven before church and cooked while they were out, and was ready to eat when they came home at 12:30. She had mastered the timing of this, the oven temperature and duration calibrated precisely against the weight of the roast and the duration of the service, which at their church ran approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes from opening hymn to closing benediction, not counting the social time on the steps afterward. A 3-pound chicken at $3.50 for an hour and 15 minutes came out perfect. She knew this the way she knew the other things she had learned through repetition, not as a recipe but as a body knowledge. The Sunday dinner tablecloth went on every week without question. the good everyday dishes, not the china, but the set above the everyday plates, a step up in formality that communicated Sunday without requiring the full china deployment. Grace was slightly longer on Sunday. Conversation at the Sunday table was different, slower, more lateral, more likely to range across the week just past and the week coming, less likely to be punctuated by requests for more milk. Something about the combination of church and the better tablecloth and the roast made everyone at the table slightly more deliberate. There is also the question of what Margaret read, and how, and what it did for her, because this is one of the threads I want to pull carefully. The library was 6 blocks away, at the end of Elm Court and then right on the main street, a small branch library housed in a 1920s brick building with a carved stone arch over the door and wooden floors that creaked in a specific and pleasing way when you walked over them. She went every 2 weeks, usually on Thursday mornings after the cleaning, and checked out 2 or 3 books at a time. The librarian. Her name was Miss Parrish, a woman in her 50s who had been at the library since before the war, knew Margaret's reading habits well enough to flag things she thought she'd like, a service Margaret accepted with genuine gratitude and came to rely on. She read novels primarily, realistic fiction. She liked the books that took you deep into another person's daily world, that showed her what it was like to be someone different, somewhere different, living a life organized around different preoccupations. She had read all of Pearl Buck that the library had. She liked Willa Cather. She liked the English novels. She had an ongoing relationship with Trollope that she'd started in 1950 and pursued in installments, moving through the Barsetshire series at whatever pace the library's copy availability permitted. She occasionally read things that were more contemporary, though contemporary fiction in 1953 had a quality of ambition, and occasionally of difficulty, that she approached with the careful respect you give to something you want to understand even when it resists you. She read in the kitchen, in the morning window. She read in bed on nights when Robert fell asleep early and left her awake in the lamplight with 30 minutes before she would be tired. She read when the children were napping. Patty still napped in the early part of our story, in the 20 minutes before the timer went off and she had to go back to something. She read in the way that readers who are perpetually under time pressure read, intensely, fully, with the concentration of people who know the reading could be interrupted and therefore refuse to half attend. The books did something for her that no other part of her life did in quite the same way. They were the evidence that there were other ways to be, other textures of daily life, other arrangements of how a person could move through the world. This is what novels do, not escape, or not only escape, but expansion. The woman in Cather's Nebraska Prairie novels had nothing in common with Margaret's post-war suburb, except that she was a woman doing hard physical work in the service of a household and a community, and the people she loved, and that parallel, oblique as it was, meant something. The recognition ran underneath the surface differences. She was always looking for that recognition. Miss Parrish at the library gave her, in the spring of 1954, a book she had not heard of, a novel by a British woman she vaguely knew the name of. She cannot now remember the title precisely. Something about a house or a name. She has not been able to trace it, and this book had a quality she found almost startling. The woman at the centre of it was ordinary and specific, in the way that the women in serious fiction were not usually ordinary and specific. Her daily life was described with the kind of attention that is usually reserved for the dramatic and the exceptional, and the ordinariness itself was treated as the story, not background, the story. Margaret read it in 3 days, which was fast for her, and then sat with the empty feeling of having finished something that addressed you in a way you didn't know you needed to be addressed. She returned it. She found she kept thinking about it. She put in a request for Miss Parrish to order more of that author. She did not talk about it to anyone, not even Dorothy. It felt too private for the kind of conversation they usually had. Some things you carry alone, and this was one of them. Now let me tell you about something I want to call the economics of the kitchen, which is distinct from the household budget and sits beneath it like a foundation. The food that Margaret produced, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, plus lunches packed for school, plus occasional baking for church events, plus the canning, plus the dinner parties, represented a quantity of labor that, if paid at the market rate of services equivalent, would have been substantial. A cook, a baker, a meal planner, a grocery buyer with the product knowledge to negotiate fresh seasonal produce and the relationship capital to get the best cuts from the butcher. All of this collapsed into the single untitled role of wife, but the economics of the kitchen went deeper than just labor. They included the knowledge that Margaret brought to the management of food costs, which was considerable and was exercised daily in ways that were invisible because they worked. She knew, without consulting anyone, that a whole chicken was more economical than chicken parts if she planned to use the carcass for stock. She knew that the slightly bruised apples in the reduced bin at the front of the produce section were fine for applesauce and good for the coffee cake she made on Sunday mornings. She knew the price per pound of ground beef versus chuck roast and understood when the cost differential was worth the extra cooking time. She knew that buying the large can of tomatoes was better value than the small if she was making soup, and that the reverse was true if she was making one specific dish that didn't need the whole large can. This knowledge is not trivial. It is the kind of knowledge that domestic economists were calling for women to acquire in the various books about household management that filled the home economics section of the library, and Margaret had acquired it, not from books mostly, but from years of practice and the particular kind of attention that comes from caring whether the numbers come out right at the end of the week. She managed a household budget that a trained accountant would have found, on examination, impressively controlled. In a different world, she would have been a very good small business manager. In this world, she was a housewife, and the skills were the same and the recognition was entirely different. Let me also tell you about Margaret's hands, specifically, because they are the physical record of everything we have discussed tonight, and they are not well served by the generalities. Her right hand was slightly stronger than her left from the years of right-hand dominant work, kneading bread, wielding the rug beater, pressing the iron, scrubbing surfaces. The base of her right thumb had that small callus from the wringer, as we mentioned. The skin on both hands was maintained with some care, the rubber gloves for chemicals, a good hand lotion she applied each evening before bed, her mother's insistence on never going to bed with dry hands echoing in her routine. But it was the skin of someone who used their hands constantly, not the skin of someone who used them occasionally. There were small scars from years of cooking, a burn mark on the inside of her right wrist from a moment of carelessness with the oven rack in 1951, small nicks from the chef's knife, the particular roughness along the first joint of the index finger from years of needle and thread. Her nails were kept trimmed short because long nails and housework were mutually exclusive, and painted, a clear polish usually, or a pale pink, because anything brighter would have looked impractical and would have carried an implication of leisure that she was not sure she wanted to invite. These hands were competent. They were capable of a range of tasks that most people today could not perform without instruction. They could feel when bread dough had reached the right elasticity, assess the seasoning of a dish from a small taste, cut a paper pattern on the bias, sew a seam that lay flat without pressing. They were the working instrument of everything Margaret knew. Robert did not think about her hands particularly, though he would have said, if asked, that Margaret had nice hands. Men of the era were not in general trained to read hands as a record of labor. Hands were hands, an aesthetic feature, something you might notice if you were the kind of man who noticed things. He was not unkind about this. He simply did not have the context to know what he was looking at. She did not expect him to. This was not a point of bitterness. It was simply the arrangement. There is also the matter of the body more broadly. Margaret's body, in this decade, in this role, which carries a different story than the one the fashion magazines told. The ideal body for an American woman in the mid-1950s was defined by a set of proportions that the girdle and the full-skirted dresses were designed to produce or suggest: a narrow, controlled waist, a full hip, a specific ratio between the two that was considered the correct silhouette. The magazines published these measurements. Dress patterns came in standardized sizes calibrated to these ideal proportions. If your body did not correspond to the ideal, and most bodies did not correspond to the ideal in any unassisted state, the clothing and the undergarments were the mechanism for closing the gap. Margaret was not anxious about her body in the way that later decades women would become anxious about their bodies, under the pressure of different but equally specific ideals. She wore the girdle because everyone wore the girdle, because not wearing it would have been unusual, because the clothing of the era was designed around its existence and fit strangely without it. She was not dieting, which was a practice that existed in this era but had not yet reached the intensity and ubiquity it would achieve in later decades. She ate what she cooked. She ate the leftover pork chop standing at the kitchen counter while she washed the dishes. She ate cookies when she baked them because the house smelled of baking, and it would have been inhumane not to. She weighed. She thought she weighed. She didn't own a scale, which was itself a small fact, somewhere around what she'd weighed since she was 22. But the body had its costs, accumulated over the years of the role. The back pain, which arrived in her late 20s, and which she addressed with aspirin and the particular straight-backed posture that managed it. The varicose veins beginning in her left leg, visible just above the knee when she wasn't wearing stockings, a gift from the years of standing on hard floors for long hours. The hands, the pervasive fatigue that was not always tired from last night's sleep fatigue, but more constitutive. The baseline tiredness of a body that did not have enough recovery time built into its schedule. She slept adequately. 7 hours on most nights, sometimes less. She did not nap. Napping was not something she permitted herself. There was always something that needed doing, and lying down in the afternoon felt like an indulgence that would cost her later in the form of tasks not done. The physical cost of the housewife's role was never named as occupational, though it was. It was called life, or age, or the natural consequence of having children, or any number of things that displaced the specificity of the cause. It was also sometimes called the price you paid for the life you had, which was said with a kind of resigned warmth that was meant to be consoling, and mostly was, because the life she had was genuinely valuable and genuinely hers, and the price, real as it was paid for something worth paying for. She would say this. I believe her. Being a housewife in 1953 meant inhabiting a role that was, in the sociological vocabulary, total. It was not a job you went to and returned from. It was the house you lived in, the husband you slept beside, the children you raised, the neighborhood you operated within. There was no clocking out. There was no private professional persona that existed separately from the domestic one. The self and the role were, by design, collapsed into each other, which was presented as a feature. The housewife was not pretending to care for her family. She was her care for her family, and there was supposedly a dignity and a wholeness in that identification. And for some women, in some moments, this was true. The total commitment had a quality of presence to it, an undistractedness that the life of divided roles does not always produce. Margaret was fully there with her children in a way that was, I believe she would say this, one of the real gifts of the arrangement. Not because working mothers are not present with their children, which would be a false conclusion, but because the structure of her day organized itself around their presence in a way that made certain kinds of attention easy and natural. She knew her children the way you know people you spend every day with. She knew their rhythms and their moods and their specific fears and the particular stories they needed at the particular times they needed them. This was knowledge she earned by being there, and it meant something to her. But there is another side of the totality, and it is worth naming. When the role is total and the self is identified with the role, the standards of the role become, in a very uncomfortable way, the standards of the self. The dirty window was not just an uncleaned window. It was a failure of Margaret, of the person Margaret was, of whether she was adequate as a wife and mother and human being. The wrinkled shirt was not a wrinkled shirt. It was evidence about her character. This is what the social system of the era, the neighborhood, the magazine standards, the television ideal, the doctor's opinion, the mother-in-law's visiting eye, was, collectively, communicating to every woman in every house like this one, every day, every year. A failed soufflé was not just a soufflé, it was a referendum. The physical toll of this, the back pain that most housewives of the era reported, the knee problems from the hours on the linoleum, the hand damage from the chemicals and the hot water and the scrubbing, was real and went largely unaddressed. Arthritis at 40 was considered a natural consequence of life rather than an occupational injury, which is what it often was. The skin damage from household chemicals and the cleaning products of the 1950s were genuinely harsher than what is available today before the regulatory oversight that now limits certain compounds in consumer products was considered the natural condition of a woman's hands rather than the result of daily exposure to caustic substances without adequate protection. Margaret has the rubber gloves because of her mother's example, but many of her neighbours do not, and their hands at 30 tell the story of their 20s in a language of roughness and early age. The mental health toll was present and largely unacknowledged in any clinical sense. The social performance requirements, always pleasant, always composed, never admitting to the stresses of the role, never giving the neighbourhood's collective eye any ammunition, produced a kind of constant low-grade suppression of emotional reality that had costs. Some women's costs were small and manageable, some were not small. Margaret is on the smaller end of the range, partly because of her own psychological constitution and partly because of genuine positive elements in her life. But she is not entirely exempt from the cost, and the thing at the kitchen window in the morning, the half-formed question that doesn't quite finish, is where the cost lives for her. There is one more territory to visit before this day fully closes, and it is the territory of what changed, or began to change, in the late years of the decade. By 1957 or 1958, something was different in the magazine articles, not dramatically different. No editor was going to run a piece titled, "The Housewife is Miserable, and Here is Why," not in that decade. But the advice columns were getting letters they hadn't gotten before, in the volume and the urgency they were arriving with. Women writing to say they were bored, not in the mild, genteel sense of boredom that the earlier decade had permitted, oh, the afternoons are quiet sometimes, but in a fuller sense, a more confessional sense. "I feel that I am waiting for my life to begin," one letter said, in an oral history I read once, a woman's memory of what she had written to a magazine in 1958. "I have done everything I was supposed to do, and I do not know why I am not happy." The advice columnists were usually kind in their responses. They suggested hobbies, they suggested church work or volunteer activity. They suggested that the questioner was perhaps expecting too much from happiness, that happiness was a byproduct of purposeful living rather than a condition to be pursued. These were not cruel responses. They were the best the responders could do within the framework they were working in, which was a framework that did not yet include the language of women's autonomy or structural limitations or any of the other categories that would eventually make a different kind of answer possible. But the letters kept coming. And meanwhile, in the suburb itself, in Margaret's neighbourhood and in neighbourhoods like it across the country, there were small accumulations of evidence that the ideal was under strain. Women going back to work in ones and twos, not because they had to, or not only because they had to, but because something in the structure of the daily life was not quite filling the space. Women enrolling in classes at the local college extension, women taking on small professional activities, a bit of bookkeeping for a local business, a few hours a week of teaching at the elementary school, that were coded carefully as help rather than career, as filling time rather than building something, but that were, underneath that coding, real work being done by real capable people who needed more than the house could hold. Margaret herself, in the fall of 1957, begins teaching a Saturday morning sewing class at the church. 6 women, 2 hours, the basics of garment construction, cutting, seaming, finishing. She did not advertise this as a professional activity. She would not have used that word. The minister's wife asked if she would help with it, and she said yes, and she prepared for each session with the same thorough attention she brought to everything she did, and the women who came learned things in those 2 hours each Saturday that they had not known before, and several of them said so, and Margaret went home afterward in a state she did not have a word for, something brighter than her usual Tuesday afternoons, something more like the feeling of having done the thing she was actually built to do. She continued teaching the class for 3 years. It was not paid. It never occurred to her that it should be, because it was a church activity. But it was real, and it was hers, and the women who took the class made things with the skills she taught them that still exist, in closets and drawers and cedar chests, if anyone could trace them back. That seems worth saying. The decade is ending. The country is changing, not in ways that are yet fully legible in the neighborhood with the yellow shutters, but in ways that are making themselves felt in the pressure of the magazine letters and the pharmaceutical prescription rates and the sewing teacher who feels something bright on Saturday mornings and doesn't have the language for it yet. The 1960s are coming, with everything they will bring, and the women who lived the 1950s housewife's life in full, the ironed shirts and the canning and the cornbread and the long walk to the school bus in their good shoes, those women will have a particular relationship with what comes next that is complicated and cannot be reduced to any single emotional register. Some of them will feel liberated by what changes. Some will feel destabilized. Some will feel both. Some will, with the practical resilience that ran the household all those years, simply adapt, take the new tools available to them, and build with what they've got. Margaret will. I feel certain of this. She is, above all things, capable. She has been capable in a very small space for a very long time. The space is going to get larger. She will fill it. But first, there is one more morning to attend to, one more alarm to beat to the moment of waking, one more kitchen, cool and dim, waiting to be lit. She slips out of bed quietly. She does not want to wake Robert. She pulls her robe from the hook on the back of the door. The hall is dark. The children are sleeping. The house has that particular early silence, heavy and still and full of the breathing of people she loves. She goes downstairs. She fills the percolator. She sets it on the back left burner, which runs slightly hotter than the others. She stands at the kitchen window in the first grey light and looks out at the garden, where the tomato plants are gone now, cut back for the winter, the cages stored in the shed, the bare soil dark and patient in the cold. In 4 months, 5 maybe, she will put seeds in small pots on the kitchen windowsill and watch for the green shoots. They always surprise her. They will again. The coffee begins to hiss. She listens. And this exact moment, the kitchen warming up around her, the coffee in its slow rising preparation, the house quiet, the garden waiting, the day entirely ahead of her, this is hers. Not the role, not the standard, not the neighbor's evaluation or the magazine's aspiration or the television's gleaming template. This moment, this window, this particular quality of early light on the frost-dark garden, this is Margaret. She is remarkable. She was always remarkable. The decade just didn't quite know how to say so. Thank you for spending this night with her and with this channel. If you've been here all the way through to the end, you are exactly the kind of listener Sleepy Old World exists for. Let yourself drift now. The day is done. The house is quiet. The work was worthy of the woman who did it. Rest well, friend.